Tonight we glide under gaslit arches and through velvet curtains that whisper when you pass, into streets where the fog tastes faintly of coal and sugar, and the cobbles remember every hurried footstep. You stand at the edge of Victorian London where hansom cabs rattle, where gentlemen lower their eyes in public and raise every eyebrow in private, where rules shapeshift the way mist wraps around a lamppost. Your heart beats a little faster, because if we are honest, curiosity is a powerful lantern, and this city is a maze that keeps building more walls the closer you look. If you enjoy drifting through these hidden histories, consider joining us for more tales that reveal what polite society preferred to forget. You probably will not survive this without questioning a moral or two, which is fine, because nobody here agrees on what virtue even means once the door closes. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You move past shop windows where polished boots gleam, past the umbrella seller calling out in a drizzle that never quite becomes rain. The city feels orderly at first look, stiff collars and measured steps, yet there is a second rhythm below the clatter. You feel it in the way a servant shuts a carriage door, a fraction too slow, in the coded nod between a porter and a gentleman whose rings flash once and then vanish inside a glove. Gaslight pools at intersections and creates little theatres of secrecy. Everyone performs. Everyone pretends not to notice. You practice your own polite face, and it fits a little too easily for comfort. Queen Victoria sits on the throne from 1837 to 1901, a long reign that teaches the world to call this the Victorian era. The empire stretches its map-coloured fingers almost everywhere the sun bothers to rise. You picture the palace windows glowing like soft coins in the night, while miles away the rookeries twist into alleys so narrow your coat brushes both walls at once. In a house that smells of polish and paraffin, a maid sands a banister for the third time today, because appearances are the city's second religion. The first is money. You are not shocked by that. You have met money before. Your boots carry you across Holborn Viaduct, and into streets where publishers stack respectable sermons in their windows and hide stranger pamphlets under the counter. The word respectability follows you like a chaperone, prim and persistent. It tells you where to look and where not to look. It explains that virtue firms the spine, improves the complexion, and prevents calamities like public embarrassment. You nod as if convinced. Meanwhile, a coach rolls by with curtains drawn so tight they might be stitched to the glass. The horses know the route by heart, which is oddly charming, and also completely unhelpful if anyone were to ask inconvenient questions. You duck into a coffee house that pretends it is only about newspapers and caffeine. The air smells of nutmeg and a little damp wool. Men bend over columns of type, frowning at foreign crises while trading tidbits about local ones. You catch a whisper about a magistrate with unusual hobbies, which is phrased in such a manner that no word actually says anything. The code is simple. Everyone agrees to understand and to forget in the same breath. You sip something too hot, and pretend it does not burn your tongue. The second sip is better. This is a reliable truth. Tea and coffee cannot fix your life, but they practice very hard at consolation. A quirky tidbit drifts to your ear. Some parlours add modesty panels to the legs of pianos, or tablecloths that fall heavily enough to quiet a blush, because in certain circles even furniture is expected to behave. The story is comic, and a little suspicious. Historians still argue whether that tradition is as widespread as people claim, the question smudged by satire and by the Victorian habit of caricaturing itself. You lean closer to the panel, as if it might confess. It only reflects a bit of gaslight, and keeps its secrets with the dignity of mahogany. Back on the street, you follow a trail of faint perfume that could be rosewater or could be wishful thinking. Respectable coats brush against anonymous shoulders, and both smell faintly of coal fires. A cabman taps his whip on the wheel, patient as a metronome. You watch a couple cross the road with careful space between their elbows, a choreography that assures the world nothing interesting is happening. The city outwardly insists on clean borders between public and private, yet you see those borders smudge wherever a doorway recesses into shadow. You are beginning to understand that the performance of virtue is as thick as the fog, and like the fog, it rolls in and out according to weather that nobody predicts well. You pause at a bookstore near the Strand where the vendor arranges sermons on temperance, beside travelogues of far-off climates. A pamphlet in tiny type describes the dangers facing fallen women with the certainty of a pocket profit. Another handbook advises mothers on preserving innocence by careful supervision of novels, which is quaint, and also wildly unrealistic in a city where the average 12-year-old knows more street geography than most cabinet ministers. The vendor offers you a tract on self-improvement, with a smile that says he will also sell you whatever is tucked beneath the counter, provided you know which question to ask. You do not ask. You simply tuck your gloves tighter and walk on. The clock of hooves prints a rhythm beside you, and you fall into step, letting the sound steady your thoughts. The public face of the era loves rules, polishes them until they shine, and hangs them where visitors can admire. A lady's hem should not trail in the gutter. A gentleman's eyes should not linger. Doors should open with the authority of oak and close with the grace of velvet. You realize the city runs on a quiet pact. If everyone behaves in the theatre of daylight, the night will pardon its actors their improvisations. It is a dangerous pact, yet it keeps the machinery humming. Your breath puffs in front of you like a soft steam engine. You look briefly theatrical yourself, which is fine. Your performance is nicely understated. A newspaper boy darts past with an armful of headlines about Parliament and potato prices, and you hear one phrase that tugs a memory of scandals you cannot place yet. The boy laughs when someone tries to haggle. He is faster than all of you, quick as a street sparrow. You smile and let him win, because even in a city that plants rules like hedges, some games are better when the youngsters triumph. Speaking of hedges, you pass a tiny square where clipped yews guard a bench, and a brass plaque informs you of a benefactor who endowed public seating, so clerks would rest their feet and not collapse into moral ruin. An earnest gesture, also a bit of a stretch. Your feet approve anyway. Gaslight spreads across London in the early 19th century, and by mid-century, illuminates major streets, theatres, and many homes, altering the hours when people feel safe to move. You watch a lamplighter lift his pole and coax a mantled glow alive. The light is steady, almost tender, and it makes secrets both safer and stranger. You notice how gaslight flattens faces at certain angles and sharpens them at others. You are tempted to test various angles. Then you remember you are not auditioning for a melodrama, at least not this minute. You hear church bells count the hour, and you imagine drawing rooms adjusting their clocks. Respectable time matters. So does the illusion that everyone shares the same schedule, yet the river keeps a different time, the docks another, and the rookeries a third. Historians still argue whether Victorian prudery reflects genuine anxiety about desire, or a public script crafted to manage crowds and reputations while private life ignored the lines. You keep this question like a pebble in your pocket. It is useful to touch, and it does not wear out. You end this walk at a rail where the Thames slides by, oily and broad, carrying whispers under bridges that look like combs raking the water. Your reflection trembles into ripples. A constable strolls past with a chin that could cut paper and a look that suggests he sees nothing unusual, which leaves you wondering what counts as unusual in a city that writes rules as often as it writes poems. You pull your coat close and feel velvet under your fingers. Respectability, like velvet, can be smooth in one direction and stubborn in the other. You pet it the safe way and smile, because you are learning the knack. By now you know that what looks pure on the postcard is complicated at street level, and that the glow of gaslight flatters even the stories people do not tell aloud. Also, your boots are finally breaking in. Congratulations, your feet have joined the 19th century. You learn the face that polite London wears in daytime, a careful smile that says everything is fine while the rules do the heavy lifting in the background. The phrase separate spheres floats through parlours like perfume. It tells you that men belong in public at desks and clubs, and that women belong in private near hearth and cradle, as if life can be filed into tidy drawers. You notice how tidy always sounds harmless until someone closes the drawer on a person. Etiquette manuals say virtue rides in a woman's reputation like a glass swan on a mantelpiece, bright but breakable. Men apparently own a sturdier version of the same bird that survives storms and clumsy elbows. If you think that is convenient, you are correct. If you think the bird metaphor is a little much, you are also correct. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 shifts divorce into civil courts, and makes the process cheaper than an Act of Parliament. But the gateway is still tilted. A husband can file on grounds of adultery alone, while a wife must prove adultery plus cruelty or desertion, or another sharpened point. You hear the rule recited in a solicitor's crisp voice, and it sounds like a door that opens easily from one side. Newspapers treat scandal as a parlour game, unless you are the woman at the centre. Then it plays more like roulette with reputation for chips. Courting rituals feel like a stage play whose script the audience knows by heart. Calling cards slide under silver trays. A folded corner hints at personal delivery. A penciled initial begs a reply. The household servant becomes the quiet postmaster of emotions. Magazines and novelty guides claim there is a language of the fan, and a language of the parasol, in which a tilt to the left means I see you and a quick snap closed means no chance at all. Historians still argue whether these codes were practiced beyond playful columns, or simply teased readers the way dream dictionaries entertain without ever diagnosing reality. You try a parasol twirl, mostly to test your wrist, and decide that if there is a code you will need a glossary and a map. The double standard walks beside you like a chaperone who only watches one person. A gentleman can stumble as long as he stands up straight by breakfast. A woman can do everything right, and still be told she walked too fast, laughed too freely, or placed a foot on the wrong carpet. Advice books warn wives to keep tempers cool, and wardrobes cooler so that husbands will not wander. You do not see similar advice aimed at husbands except the occasional sermon that clucks without naming names. The lesson is simple. If a marriage fails, the public looks toward the wife as if she set the table wrong and that tipped the whole house. You want to nudge the table a little out of spite. You settle for straightening the forks with suspicious precision. Property law puts weight behind the smile. Under coverture, a married woman's legal identity folds into her husband's. Her wages, her furniture, sometimes even the clothes on her back can be counted as his. Reform arrives like a patient visitor. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 begin to let wives own earnings and inherit without those assets vanishing into a husband's ledger. You think of receipts tucked into reticules like tiny banners of independence. Clerks might not cheer, but the ink on the contracts grows less smug. Change does not solve every problem, yet you feel the hinge on the door loosened by a notch. Out on the street, the theatres keep up their moral arithmetic. A rake in a comedy offers charm and exits with a wink. A fallen woman in a melodrama exits with a cough, a cloaked figure, and a final violin chord. Audiences applaud the comedy and dab eyes at the melodrama, then return to their routines, feeling uplifted. You quietly suspect the plays are teaching the crowd to live with contradictions, which is great for ticket sales and puzzling for anyone trying to be real. You are reminded to keep your own script short and your stage directions clear. Take a bow, do not trip. Remember where the trapdoor sits. Law and gossip partner, like a dance duo that smiles too much. Breach of promise suits, let a jilted fiancé claim damages for a broken engagement. The legal system admitting that reputations can be smashed like porcelain, and someone should pay. Meanwhile, seduction cases treat certain men as cunning foxes and certain women as hapless hens, a metaphor that does not flatter anyone involved, including poultry. You pass a tavern where clerks whisper about a banker's daughter and a coach ride that took too long, and you can feel the judgment searching for a familiar groove to settle into. Conversation in respectable homes can sound like a clock shop where every pendulum agrees on the hour. Mothers advise daughters to cultivate silence. Fathers advise sons to cultivate success. Silence is heavy work. Success is noisy and applauded. You watch a dinner table where the talk glides from empire to steam engines to a cousin's wedding, and the moment anyone mentions a woman's ambition, the conversation fogs over as if someone opened the door to the winter garden. That fog lifts quickly when the topic turns to cricket. You sip your soup and practice a smile that reveals nothing and forgives everything. It pairs nicely with the fish course. Clubs are temples of privacy. Rules prohibit discussion of politics or religion, which cleverly means men discuss both in magnificent detail. In certain rooms, servants are invisible by design, which is to say, everyone knows they exist, and everyone pretends they do not. You understand that secrets travel in two directions. They float up staircases from sculleries, and they drift down from drawing rooms in bits of overheard thunder. Somewhere a housemaid knows why a door was locked at noon, and a butler knows how the master looks at mirrors. Those observations rarely print themselves, yet they shape the weather of a neighborhood. Debates about female education and employment gather heat. Schools for girls expand curricula beyond needlework, placing mathematics beside music and literature beside sewing patterns. Typing rooms hum, and the new machines turn letters into livelihoods. You hear a headmistress say that a girl's mind deserves exercise, not delicate storage. A few parents nod, as if this is outrageous and delightful. A few scowl, as if this is a conspiracy. Historians still argue whether these shifts grew from economic necessity or moral conviction, though anyone who has ever paid rent knows that necessity usually runs faster. The state keeps one eye on bodies and another on reputations. Age of consent laws rise in the 1880s, reflecting public outrage at headlines and the agitation of reformers who refuse to lower their voices. Newspapers splash words like purity, as if language can bleach what society neglects to clean. The irony is not lost on you. Men who sign petitions may also sign hotel ledgers under initials. Respectable citizens send coins to rescue societies and then walk home by long routes with soft shoes. You try not to sigh too loudly, it fogs the window. A final glance at etiquette brings a smile. Some households hang antimacassars, lacy covers to protect upholstery from hair oil favored by gentlemen. The covers sit like doilies with a mission, and they look oddly heroic. If fabric can guard a chair from masculine residue, perhaps custom can guard a life from careless habits. The comparison is not perfect. The antimacassar does its job without lecturing anyone. A joke drifts into your head. If only reputations could be protected with washable lace, the laundress would be the most powerful woman in town. You tuck the joke away for later, and let the room settle. When the lamps are turned down, and the last carriage rattles away, you notice the mask of decency resting on a mantel like an opera prop. Morning will pin it back in place, tidy as ever. Tonight it looks almost shy, as if even the mask understands it has been asked to do too much. You stretch your fingers, breathe in cold smoke and lavender water, and allow the city to slow by a fraction. You are not fooled by the polite silence, but you can appreciate the skill that keeps it intact. Skill deserves acknowledgement, even when it is used to hide, and especially when it is used to judge. You stand on a quiet square, where the curtains glow like warm honey, and the door knockers shine, as if they polish themselves at night. The street feels righteous enough to advertise itself as a parable, yet one townhouse keeps catching your eye. The steps are scrubbed, the brass numerals are modest, and the maid who opens the window remembers to blink as if on cue. If you hesitated and said you were looking for a friend, a card would appear on a silver tray with a name written in a hand so elegant it could thread a needle. A small mark in the corner might look like decoration. It is a code, you are expected to know it without asking. The way a regular knows where the loose stair creaks and where not to hang a hat. Privacy here is not a wall, it is a choreography. In Victorian England, prostitution itself is not illegal, but running a brothel, living on the earnings of another, and street soliciting are offences that police can act upon. The legal net is woven to catch places rather than moments, which suits the neighbourhood. The house you are studying does not advertise itself with music or laughter. It sells silence and good upholstery. Discretion is the premium. If dignity had a price list, it would look like the rates inside the small ledger on the hall table. You step inside for a minute that lasts longer than it should. The gentleman's cloak hangs beside a barrister's hat, which says more than any pamphlet. The carpet eats your footsteps. A clock ticks like a careful heartbeat. The woman who greets you wears a gown cut to flatter and a smile cut to reassure. She glides, which is both a talent and a business model. She introduces herself as the proprietress, which sounds respectable because that is the point. Tea arrives in a pot, so heavy it could anchor a small boat, which is probably an accident, and also a metaphor. You accept a cup and become part of the scenery. You are very good at pretending to be furniture. Clients come from everywhere. The law writes with blue ink. Judges step in, as if doors salute them. Clerks arrive after payday with gloves still smelling of ink and soap. Peers of the realm send their cards by footman and follow later, pretending to admire the wallpaper first. The calling cards matter. A discreet motif in the embossing, a corner clipped, a flourish in the initial. Each detail can announce preferences without speaking aloud. Some houses keep a basket of neutral cards for new clients who mislay their own, a courtesy that allows a person to be introduced to the door under an alias so elegant it deserves its own cufflinks. Historians still argue whether that custom was widespread or a luxury of a few high houses on the richest streets, the evidence scattered between police reports and memoirs that exaggerate with a twinkle. The rooms are arranged to feel inevitable. Parlours promise conversation. Antechambers promise privacy. Curtains are thick enough to deserve compliments. The bookshelf offers sermons with spines deep enough to hide a small safe. In that safe rests a ledger that never leaves the house. You imagine its ruled columns marching like a tiny army of discretion. First names only, sometimes not even those, just initials and the kind of symbols a bookkeeper would respect. Prices vary with hour, with company, with additional arrangements that sound like musical terms if you do not look closely. Money moves like a river, and the house directs it with the composure of a lockkeeper. Servants keep the place alive. The maid who opens the door, also watches the street through a thread of net curtain to spot constables or curious journalists. The cook understands that good food keeps clients from wobbling into scandal, and that oysters can be advertised as fortifying without anyone blushing too hard. The house cat performs security by glaring at anyone who forgets to wipe their boots. You respect the cat. The cat respects no one. It is the only true aristocrat in the room. If the cat ever writes its memoirs, the libel suits will need their own annex. Law brushes against commerce like two coats hanging too close. Raids happen often after a neighbor complains, or a constable aims to show industry at the end of the quarter. The proprietress prepares for this, with an emergency drill that would impress a fire brigade. Music ceases. Doors lock. Guests discover a second staircase that leads to a quiet exit into a mews where a groom coughs twice if anyone unfamiliar approaches. Historians still argue whether police warnings to elite houses were formalized favors or informal understandings. The line between courtesy and corruption is thin as silk ribbon. Your instinct says people are talented at survival when embarrassment is more feared than fines. Conversation inside has its own etiquette. No names that can be shouted across a courtroom. No gossip that can be traced to a specific dinner table. The exception is harmless scandal involving hats, which everyone agrees are fair game. You sit with a cup and listen to the soft percussion of laughter. A judge tells a joke you would not survive outside these walls. You file it under bad decisions and decide not to repeat it. If common sense wore boots, it would stamp on that punchline and send it to bed without supper. The furniture understands its role. Sofas are sturdy enough for gravity and fainting. Mirrors are positioned to flatter, not to spy. Lamps are shaded to make skin look warm. The house smells of beeswax and orange peel, the universal scent of preparedness. The Metropolitan Police and magistrates use the term disorderly house in charges, a phrase that manages to be both vague and devastating. You think about how order is defined by whoever holds the pen. Inside this house, order looks like a well-placed cushion, and a calendar kept with almost military neatness. Prices rise with privacy. A very private room costs more. A room that ensures two clients will never meet in a corridor costs more again. Champagne is an add-on that arrives with a sound that is practically ceremonial. Some establishments keep small coin scales to verify sovereigns, a holdover from an age of clipped edges and light pockets. The little balance trembles with moral significance for about 3 seconds and then becomes simply efficient. The proprietress has no intention of accepting counterfeit romance or counterfeit currency. Not everything here markets desire. Some of it markets listening. Men who carry decisions on their shoulders crave an hour when no one asks for judgment. A woman who understands the art of attention can charge fairly for that calm. You watch how a well-timed nod replaces a sermon, how a question shaped like an open window lets someone breathe. The skill is its own profession. It rarely earns a statue. It keeps this house standing. Occasionally role-play costumes arrive in hat boxes that pretend to be for dressmakers. A country livery is only a costume until a duke calls it tradition. A nun's veil is a joke that stops just short of blasphemy, because the house prefers to keep lightning at a respectful distance. Historians still argue whether such theatrics were common or embellished by scandal sheets to sell copies. You suspect both can be true at once. Theatricality loves a plausible deniability clause. Blackmail lurks like a draft under a door. The house fights it with routine. Names are never written in full. Letters from clients are returned or burned without ceremony. A trusted cabman is paid to wait and paid again to forget. The lion's share of tragedy in this trade comes when secrecy breaks. The proprietress reads the city the way sailors know wind. She plots routes that avoid sharp corners and newspapers. You admire the competence even as you wish the world required less of it. Time folds strangely here. Afternoon can feel like midnight, if the curtains are kind. You hear a piano above, playing a piece that keeps wanting to turn into something famous and then modestly declines. Guests leave lighter by coin and heavier by calm. Some will walk home through parks where the moon polishes the gravel. Some will ride back to houses where portraits glare. Every portrait frame believes it is a moral compass, which is adorable if you ignore the family history. You step back out to the square, and the facade looks exactly as you found it. The house has resumed the expression of virtue that townhouses practice when they nap. You button your coat and pretend you are made of normal errands. The maid draws the curtains with the precision of a theatre closing Act 1. You listen for the city's larger story to rise, a blend of wheels and river breath. The door behind you snicks softly. If discretion had a sound, it would be that quiet click. and the promise that nothing happened if nobody is willing to describe it. You find yourself in a shop whose windows pretend to sell stationery. The display offers quills, sealing wax, and a very innocent diary with a lock shaped like a tiny heart. Inside, the shelves change their mind. Here are ribboned bundles of birch twigs, trimmed and tied as neatly as wedding bouquets. Here are canes in discreet sleeves that rid schoolroom supplies. The owner speaks with the professional calm of a pharmacist, and smells faintly of lavender oil and varnish. You nod, and study a price list that manages to sound both stern and festive. Discipline, it seems, has a thriving retail arm. Corporal punishment is common in 19th century Britain, not only in prisons and the military, but also in many public schools where birching or caning is presented as character building. You picture halls lined with mottled stone, prefects rehearsing the tone that means duty, and headmasters who keep ledgers to ensure penalties are orderly. That reality leaks into private fantasies, and the era learns to market the schoolroom as a stage. The governess appears starched and calm with authority hidden in a sleeve. The pupil appears contrite or not, with a script that changes depending on who is paying for the ticket. The governess occupies a peculiar social bracket. She eats with the family, but does not belong to it. She corrects the children but has no power to command the staff. She reads poetry after the schoolroom fire fades, and owns more grammar than silks. Perhaps that in-between aura supplies the glamour. In fiction she becomes the instrument of order, a safe vessel for severity that can be admired and feared without scandalizing guests. You notice how often tales speak of correction in the language of moral improvement, as if virtue has learned to count strokes and issue receipts. A neat trick, also a familiar one. Some vendors claim their birch bundles are soaked in brine before drying, which supposedly increases the sting and the longevity of each twig. The description is practical and theatrical at once. The mind does half the work, already flinching before the first tap. Historians still argue whether such preparations were truly common, or mostly a boast that travelled by whisper and advertisement, unprovable, and therefore perfect for people who preferred their imaginations slightly salted. You step into a reading room at the back, where a few volumes rest behind a curtain. They are bound in brown leather, and look like legal texts until you open them. Inside, governesses correct not only posture but destiny, and wicked pupils beg for reform that arrives in measured intervals. The grammar is polished. The morals are theatrical. The rooms are always perfectly tidy by the last page. If only dusting could be taught with such enthusiasm, every mantle in Britain would shine like a bishop's ring. You drift toward Holywell Street in your memory. The lane once crowded with second-hand books and the kind of pamphlets that wore plain wrappers. It was famous for risque print sold beside sermons and sea stories, as if all three were cousins meeting for Sunday tea. The Obscene Publications Act of 1857 gives authorities power to seize material deemed corrupting, yet enforcement often depends on zeal, connections and luck. Shops learn to speak in code. A customer asks for educational dialogues, meaning a certain style of tale where learning behaves badly. Another asks for school discipline songs, which is not music in any ordinary sense. Names drift through the air, like the scent of singed sugar. A poet with a taste for the lash writes verse that sounds like sea spray and thunderclaps. Private memoirs circulate describing governesses who polish souls with meticulous patience. Underground magazines appear for a season, then vanish when printers grow nervous. You wonder how many stories were written as satire and consumed as instruction, or written as instruction and defended as satire. Historians still argue whether the flagellation craze reflects a specific Victorian spike or a constant human curiosity that simply found new labels for old wishes. Upmarket houses create themed rooms, sometimes described as educational parlours. The furniture is real, the shelves hold textbooks, and the bell pull rings to summon tea. Yet the door locks quicker than a headmaster's temper, and the lesson plans are more flexible than any grammar. The proprietor might keep a gown cut like a governess's dress, plain and dignified, with a starched white collar that can be adjusted to express varying degrees of moral weather. Clients purchase scripts as much as touch. They want to rehearse fault and consequence, to float snugly inside a story where someone else owns the rules. It is a strangely restful ambition. Not all customers seek pain. Many request the choreography without impact, the rhythm of scolding and forgiveness, the rustle of skirt and the snap of air where the cane stops short. The theatre is the point. Your ear picks up the pattern. Reprimand, pause, reassurance, promise to improve, reprieve or not. The sequence is as soothing as a lullaby that pretends to be stern. If metronomes could blush, this one would be red as a wax seal. Some artisans display canes with ivory ferrules carved into discreet motifs, or brushes for the imaginary chalk that appears in certain narratives. Tailors stitch modest dresses with reinforced seams because fantasies can be energetic. Shopkeepers sell padded stools and lecture desks with shallow drawers for ribbons and keys. You realize the props are doing the ancient work of ritual. A costume signals a role, a room signals a game, and the self loosens its tie for an hour. No one claims the experience is about desire in plain words. Everyone claims it is about improvement. The euphemism works like a velvet curtain, and the curtain is half the fun. In households that practice a more literal discipline, servants know to disappear when tempers rise. Some masters mistake anger for authority. That is another story, colder and smaller. You keep your attention on the consensual parlor, where the economy and the script are negotiated. It is important to remember that behind the lacquer of tales sits a market, and markets thrive on repeat business, which means outcomes designed to satisfy rather than scare. Consent is often a quiet word here, but when it goes missing, the entire theatre collapses. Printed dialogues introduce governess characters with names like Miss Prudence or Miss Constantia, figures who promise to correct without cruelty and prize decorum, as if it were a delicate tea service. The writers choose adverbs, the way cooks choose spices, a heavy sprinkle of sternly and a final garnish of tenderly. Sometimes a pupil is a grown man who behaves like a schoolboy, and sometimes a schoolgirl who narrates with a voice suspiciously mature for 16. You suspect ghostwriters who enjoyed contradictions and an audience that did not mind arithmetic errors in age as long as the narrative kept its balance. If only algebra were taught with such dedication, attendance would quadruple and everyone would suddenly love homework. The moralists scowl, yet the market keeps walking. Reformers publish tracts about the dangers of indecent print and the corruption of household staff by wicked pamphlets. Magistrates seize shipments at docks while vendors transfer inventory through interior courtyards where laundry flaps like flags of surrender. A policeman peers through a shop door, then shrugs and continues his beat. If the display shows nothing more sinful than envelopes, the line between punishable and permissible is a chalk mark that the rain keeps smearing. You leave the stationery shop with a mild ache between your brows, the kind that comes from studying too many coded labels. Outside, London has grown a darker shine. Lamps repeat themselves along the street, like exclamation points that forgot their sentences. The air tastes of coal and night violets. You pass a schoolroom window where a real governess bends over a slate and a real child imitates her looping hand. Knowledge is learned in loops. Even here the city mutters a truth you can feel in your ribs. People will always search for rituals to hold their shadows safely, and they will always decorate those rituals with props that look respectable on a receipt. You slip into a photographer's studio that smells of varnish, hot glass, and a little ego. Sunlight pours through a slanted skylight diffused by gauze, so the rays feel like warm water on your face. A camera stands on a wooden tripod, a big black eye with a brass rim, and beside it sits a stack of cards the size of a palm. The assistant powders a sitter's cheeks, dabs the shine off a forehead, and whispers about holding still. You listen to the clock tick while a gentleman practices his dignified chin. The room is a theatre where the curtain is made of velvet, and the applause is a crisp photograph slipped into your hand. The craze for carte de visite sweeps Britain in the late 1850s and 1860s. Small album prints mounted on card, perfect for exchanging, collecting, and tucking into albums that sit on parlors like social passports. You can buy a prince, a prima ballerina, a preacher with a notable beard, or yourself. The format democratizes faces. For a price lower than a fine dinner, you can sit in a stiff chair and become a tiny celebrity in your own drawing room. The camera's hum is reputation reheated and served with pasteboard. Albums multiply on tables, their gilt edges glinting. Visitors flip pages and pretend to be surprised that their host knows someone mildly famous. The assistant offers a stereoscope, a wooden viewer shaped to fit the nose, and slides in a paired image, so your eyes merge the two into a miniature world that rises and sinks like a tide. Queen Victoria publicly admired the stereoscope at the Great Exhibition of 1851, and every shopkeeper with a window took the hint. The viewer becomes a respectable toy that can also be a trapdoor, depending on what picture finds its way in. The respectable catalogue is only half the inventory. Behind a curtain, the studio keeps a drawer with a quiet lock. Inside rest photographs, that would never survive the front window. The poses are careful. The props are familiar. A chair, a vase, a drape that insists nothing extraordinary is happening. Yet the sitter's expression tells the real story. These pictures travel by handshakes, not advertisements, and their price reflects the risk. When someone asks for something more daring, the assistant coughs and mentions retouching fees. The risk does not stop the market. Risk is part of the price. Some studios keep hollow book boxes on a shelf labeled with titles like Sermons for Youth, which open to reveal a pocket where 2 or 3 small prints can ride home without alarming a carriage footman or a nosy aunt. The cover even rattles with a paper bookmark, so the ruse looks honest when jostled. Historians still argue whether such boxes were common practice or the invention of a few enterprising shops along the smarter streets, the evidence scattered between gossip and a handful of surviving props. Either way, the disguise has a tidy sense of humor. Nothing hides faster than a pious title. Technology cooperates with appetite. The wet collodion process demands speed. Plates sensitized and exposed while still tacky, which makes studios feel like kitchens during the dinner rush. The assistant flies from darkroom to camera and back again, counting under breath, while the sitter tries to look immortal. When the clandestine session begins, the routine does not change much. Curtains are drawn tighter. The door bolt slides. Poses are planned for quick exposure, because nobody wants to hold still for a scandal. If patience is a virtue, every model deserves an honorary halo. Some photographers sell illusions to soften danger. A painted stocking, added with a retouching pencil, becomes a paper fig leaf. A neckline rises by half an inch where the pencil darkens. A shawl appears modestly, where none existed. The image can pass a nervous glance and still tell the initiated what they paid to see. Customs men at the docks know these tricks, which is why they squint at French shipments and tap packages on their corners, listening for cardboard that thuds like secrets. The traffic flows anyway. A river never stops just because someone holds up a teacup and orders it to. Stereoscopic views create their own subculture. A pair of images of a boudoir can look like innocent furniture until the cards are swapped for another pair, and suddenly the empty chair is occupied by a figure who is not wearing much beyond the confidence of a professional. The effect is unsettling and persuasive, as if privacy has learned a magic trick. Collectors gather sets behind paneling, arranging them in cigar boxes that smell of cedar and bravado. If curiosity paid rent, half the landlords in London would be out of business. Furniture joins the conspiracy. Cabinet makers are happy to build secret drawers with clever catches that release only when a person slides a finger under the right molding. Gentlemen display parquet writing desks that hold letters and blotters above, and something more candid in the hidden tier below. A sideboard in a respectable dining room might shelter a short stack of cards behind the cutlery tray, sealed in waxed paper like contraband sweets. A clock case with a lift-off back panel has room for a packet that a maid will never dust. This is not myth. Private carpentry bills sometimes note extra fittings without describing their purpose. The blank line says everything. Importers boast that Paris offers a higher standard of daring, and that London buys it in quantity. British studios disagree with equal pride. They claim their work knows the local taste, which favors suggestion over display and a flattering angle over an indiscreet focus. Historians still argue whether the bulk of illicit photographs were imported from the continent or made domestically under the noses of the same moralists who thundered at Parliament. Surviving prints often travel without paperwork, and forgery has always loved a profitable decade. Your conclusion is modest. Desire speaks with many accents when the door is closed. Obscenity law rattles its chains whenever the market gets noisy. The 1857 Act allows seizure of offensive material, yet what counts as offensive bends and stretches with the mood of magistrates. A photo of a dancer in tights can pass in one borough and be impounded in another. Some photographers respond with humor. They sell the same pose twice, once with a shawl added by pencil, and once without, then ask the customer to pick a version that suits his conscience. The conscience often chooses both, to compare purely for research. You try not to roll your eyes. It would be unprofessional. Studios cultivate intermediaries. A tobacconist, who sells gentlemen their shaving soap and cigars, will pass a small wrapper with a special order as long as the buyer pays cash and keeps his voice lower than the counter. A hotel porter can guide a traveler to a studio that will oblige a souvenir, discreet and fast. A sailor on leave might buy a cheaper print copied from a copy, the details fuzzy, the thrill intact. At the very bottom of the market, street sellers peddle crude woodcuts pretending to be photographs. Even disappointment finds a customer when the price is right. Women appear on both sides of the lens, and not only as models. A few studios employ women retouchers whose hands are steadier than the men bragging in the front room. Their names sit on no window glass, but their pencil lines decide what a viewer will notice first. The pay is small, and the irony is large. The same society that lectures women about modesty hires their eyes to perfect images that would send a vicar into a sermon that lasts all afternoon. If hypocrisy rang like a shutter, the whole city would be a chorus. The appetite for possession changes the way people touch paper. A man who treats bills roughly turns careful when he handles a small print wrapped in tissue. The tissue crinkles like snow and then melts in the hand. He studies the image as if it can answer something that conversation will not. Perhaps it can. A photograph promises reality without acquaintance, intimacy without aftermath. The promise is both honest and treacherous. It offers a glance that never looks back. You leave the studio holding nothing, which is the safest thing to hold. Outside, sunlight feels sharper after the velvet room. A street vendor fries chestnuts, and the scent is so warm, you nearly forgive the city for its secret habits. The camera has taught everyone a new magic. Faces can travel without bodies. Rooms can live inside pockets. A look can be filed between sermons, ready for a winter evening when the fire needs a story. You walk on with your hands empty, and your head full of tiny pictures that other people will never see, which is perhaps the cleanest way to collect them. You stand at a newsstand as the city inhales, then coughs out paper. Headlines crowd each other like gulls fighting for a crust, and boys with inky fingers shout a title that sounds like a melodrama written by a thunderstorm. You buy a copy because everyone buys a copy, and because the man next to you looks as if he will climb the counter if he has to. The pages crackle, the type smudges your thumb, and the words lift off the paper like sparks. A journalist claims London hides a market where girls are bought and broken, and he writes with the zeal of a prosecutor mixed with the pattern of a sermon. You do not admire the taste of it, but you cannot stop reading. The city cannot either. It is as if the pavement itself starts repeating the title under its breath. In July 1885, the Pall Mall Gazette publishes a series that becomes known as the Maiden Tribute, the work of its editor W. T. Stead. The uproar pushes Parliament within weeks to pass the Criminal Law Amendment Act, that raises the age of consent from 13 to 16 and tightens penalties against procurement and brothel keeping. You can feel the power of spectacle nudge the law like a shoulder shove. Clerks who usually snore through debates find their pens flying. Preachers who prefer caution add extra thunder to their Sunday stock. Even cabmen argue statutes, while horses flick tails at flies with legislative indifference. The city's appetite for print turns carnivorous. Copies sell out so quickly that people rent a sheet for 10 minutes, squinting while leaning on counters, paying again to finish the final column. Some shopkeepers reportedly paste the pages in their windows and charge a penny to stand on a crate and read, a peep show of paragraphs where the only undressed thing is restraint. Historians still argue whether those improvised reading stands were common or exaggerated by gossip hungry for a comic angle in a grim week. But the image fits a city that can monetize both outrage and boxes. The narrative inside arranges itself like a stage set. Stead writes of investigators, transactions, sealed rooms, a girl guided through a door and into darkness. He claims chloroform. He claims complicity among landladies and procurers and police who look away. He calls London a modern Babylon, and he means it to sting. You feel your shoulders stiffen, not because moral language is new, but because this voice collects the city into a single accusation, and then sells it like a ticket. The detail that hits your ribs is not the rhetoric. It is the price mentioned in passing, a few coins that sound like a loaf and a pot of tea. Evil always becomes more real when it fits in a pocket. Crowds gather near the Gazette office, shoulder to shoulder, men on tiptoe, and women half hidden behind parasols that look suddenly like shields. The police arrive to keep order and discover that order is a relative term when the entire street vibrates from throat to curb. You watch a constable rub the bridge of his nose, and wonder how a person polices a panic that feels like a weather front. The air keeps smelling of printing ink and rain, a mixture that always foretells arguments. The Salvation Army collaborates with reformers to publicize the campaign and raise alarm about trafficking and the vulnerability of poor families. Names of respectable people float through the narrative like buoys, some approving, some shaking heads, but all pulled by the same current. Committees meet, leaflets multiply like spring rabbits. The House of Commons debates late into nights that feel like winters. You turn a page that trembles because your hand does. Then the twist that crowds love most arrives. The journalist stands in the dock. Stead faces trial for the abduction of a young girl, Eliza Armstrong, whom he arranged to purchase to prove his case. A plan hatched with intermediaries, who insisted it would be temporary and righteous. The girl's mother protests. The law ceases to admire the man who broke it to make a point. In October 1885, he receives 3 months in prison. You find yourself stuck between applause and recoil, a position the era seems to require as often as tea. Historians still argue whether his tactics were necessary shock or unforgivable trespass, and whether the ends justified methods that bruised the very people the campaign said it was saving. You walk past a church where the sermon swells, and the minister wraps the panic in a cloth of purity. He means well, and he knows his audience. A woman sits rigid in the pew ahead of you, and twists a handkerchief into a rope that will not hold anything. Outside, a street seller hawks a satirical broadside that turns the language of Babylon into a joke about Parliament's speed, as if the only way to look at a stampede is to sketch it. Even the caricaturists are out of breath, and their pencils usually run marathons. The law that passes carries more than one intention. The same statute that raises the age of consent also contains a clause criminalizing acts of gross indecency between males, a section that will outlast the panic and leave bruises no committee plans to count. That contradiction sits in your throat, like a dry crumb. Reform can be a busy cart. Sometimes the right goods ride alongside the wrong ones. You consider how often urgency escorts unintended passengers to the statute book, and how rarely those passengers are asked for tickets. Newspapers behave like weather vanes on a spinning roof. Some praise the exposé as necessary cleansing. Others scold the theatrics, arguing that the city suffers from exaggeration more than sin. Letters to editors bloom into forests of handwriting, some trembling, some triumphant. You learn that respectable homes are not immune to the fever. Mothers burn novels after breakfast. Fathers lecture sons who yawn into napkins. If anxiety could be bottled, chemists would sell out by noon. In courts, the testimonies are messy, as human stories always are when squeezed into orderly boxes. Witnesses contradict themselves. Memory behaves like fog near the river. Money appears, then hides, then appears again. The girl at the center fades into paper shadows as adults occupy the stage, a habit so ancient it ought to be bored of itself. You catch yourself searching for her face in the crowd outside. You do not find it. The feeling that follows is not noble. It is tired. Pamphleteers claim victory. Politicians declare duty done. The city, however, learns a lesson that will take longer to digest. Sensation can move mountains. It can also kick stones down onto the people in the valley. Reform societies split over what methods to bless next. Some prefer patient investigation. Some prefer brass bands and banners. Historians still argue whether the panic revealed a hidden epidemic, or mostly magnified a real but smaller evil into headlines that devoured context. Arguments echo in tea rooms until the scones grow cold and the butter sulks. Yet something solid does shift. Girls who would have been treated as property receive a little more protection by letter of the law. Police acquire new tools for prosecuting procurers who prey on the desperate. Charities gain funding and the confidence to knock on doors that once shut in their faces. You refuse to call any of this tidy. Nothing involving poverty and bodies and power is ever tidy. But you can admit that a page read by thousands until the ink went soft helped push a door. What waited beyond the door was better for some and worse for others. And the city has never been good at arithmetic when it counts pain. As the panic ebbs, printers clean their forms and fret about the next story. Citizens return to habits with tiny adjustments in how they hold their daughters' hands at crossings and how long they watch a stranger on a corner. The journalist in prison writes letters that sound like sermons inside stone. Supporters deliver fruit and optimism. Detractors deliver silence and occasional glee. If there were a market for "I told you so," brokers would have to invent a new exchange. You fold the last page and look up at a sky, the color of pewter. The city settles by degrees. A lamplighter moves along the row, touching each mantle with a practiced gesture, and the glow seems kinder than the words you have been reading. You walk home slowly because speed does not match the day. Behind you, the newsstand stacks its crates, the owner rubbing a thumb against a coin, as if trying to find out what story it has already bought. Your hands still carry a smear of ink. You consider keeping it as a souvenir, and decide the river will prefer it. You stand outside a brick hospital where the windows reflect a pale morning, and the sign tries to look kind. The street is quiet except for boots on gravel, and the clink of a key against a ring. A constable lingers near the gate and studies everyone with a professional frown. You feel the weight of a policy that treats bodies like maps to be measured and patrolled. The words Contagious Diseases Acts arrive with the chill of official ink. They sound neutral, almost clean, yet the practice behind them is anything but gentle. In 1864, 1866, and 1869, Parliament passes a set of statutes known as the Contagious Diseases Acts, applied to selected garrison and naval towns such as Portsmouth, Plymouth, Chatham, Aldershot, and a string of ports where soldiers and sailors spend pay. The acts allow police to detain women they suspect of prostitution and compel internal medical examinations. Those judged infected are confined in lock hospitals for treatment, often for months. Men are not subject to the same regimen. The stated goal is to protect the health of the armed forces and reduce venereal disease that clogs barracks sick lists and drains regiments of strength. You look at the gate again and imagine a ledger that cares more about numbers than names. Inside the waiting room, the benches are scrubbed, and the air carries a sharp medicinal note like winter kept in a bottle. A medical officer in a black coat folds a form with the neatness of someone who alphabetizes his spoons. The routine takes on a clockwork rhythm: inspect, record, decide, confine. The wording on the paper sounds oddly polite, as if civility could cancel humiliation. A nurse whispers a number to another nurse, and you realize that privacy here travels by digits more than by surnames. Campaigners later call the speculum the steel instrument, and in meetings they give speeches so fierce that listeners flinch without ever seeing the thing. Pamphlets describe how examination tables earn nicknames from patients that sound like grim jokes told to stay brave. Some hospitals claim to serve beef tea and small portions of stout as restorative nutrition, a treatment plan that would make a brewer nod and a vicar frown. Historians still argue whether such comforts were common or a feature of a few better-funded institutions that wished to look merciful on inspection day. You trace the path of the system in your head. A woman arrested in a subjected district can be brought before a magistrate. If registered as a common prostitute, she is required to present herself for periodic examinations. Refusal can mean imprisonment. A finding of infection brings confinement in a lock ward until declared cured by the same authority that sealed the door. The discrepancy is not subtle. Men who pay for company and carry disease back to barracks remain outside the net. The argument in defense of the policy is military efficiency. The argument against it is everything else. Josephine Butler steps into the story like a bell, clear and insistent. She is a reformer with a voice that climbs over walls and a stamina that embarrasses weaker knees. She helps form the Ladies' National Association in 1869 and leads a campaign for repeal that lasts more than a decade. Meetings fill halls from coastal towns to London, and petitions accumulate like snowfall until the pile of names looks heavier than the law. She speaks of consent as a moral minimum, and of justice that should apply to both sexes, or else to neither. You imagine her handwriting, tidy and unafraid, marching down page after page. Elsewhere, the system defends itself. Military surgeons count cases and parade tables of decline in certain districts, arguing that the acts reduce infection among troops. Critics counter with different statistics, and point out that numbers in one town do not excuse the method. Historians still argue whether the acts achieved any sustained reduction or simply pushed disease into shadows and onto women who had fewer choices than anyone writing those reports. The graphs do not bleed. The people behind them do, which is why the debate never quite cools. You watch a patrol on a quay, where ships bristle with ropes and canvas. The wind smells of tar and salt, and something medicinal that rides skin. A plainclothes officer studies faces in doorways, the way a gambler studies cards. Suspicions can be as thin as a skirt hem, or as thick as a rumor. Some women carry small notebooks of references from employers and landladies, proof of respectability offered like a shield. The shield does not always work. In a world where suspicion is policy, an ordinary walk can become evidence because a particular constable decided it should be. Lawyers begin to pick at definitions. Who counts as a common prostitute in a district where the economy mixes informal domestic service with seasonal work and unpaid help in family shops? What weight should be given to a woman's own testimony about her life? Which doctor decides how long confinement must last? The questions multiply until even magistrates reach for handkerchiefs to polish their glasses and buy time. If confusion could be taxed, the Treasury would close the books early for once. Newspapers enjoy the fight. Editorials thunder about protecting soldiers, about preserving women's virtue, about the dignity of the nation, sometimes all in the same column. Caricatures show stern matrons waving pamphlets like flags and red-faced officers hiding behind charts. In coffee houses, the arguments turn personal within 5 minutes. Someone declares that contagion respects no morals. Someone else declares that morals are the only vaccine worth having. Cups rattle, spoons clink. The froth rises and falls as if the milk itself has an opinion. The medical rooms reveal their own contradictions. Some doctors pursue careful, humane practice, explain what will happen, and treat patients like human beings whose comfort matters. Others hurry as if compassion were an extravagance. Treatment options are uneven. Mercury-based ointment still haunts certain shelves, a remnant of older practice that cures and harms in the same breath. Bed rest is prescribed as if a room could heal a life that has been complicated by hunger, danger, and the mathematics of rent. You watch a nurse tuck a blanket corner with a tenderness that refuses cynicism, and you decide that small mercies deserve their own column in any ledger. The campaign for repeal refuses to go away. Public meetings grow larger. Men begin to stand up in support, some because their wives dragged them, some because the logic finally pierced the armor of habit. Clergymen sign statements, and a few brave doctors confess that compulsion poisons trust and undermines any hope of reaching the very people who need medical help most. Parliamentary committees sit, rise, sit again, and clear their throats so often that a singer could use them as warm-up exercises. If clearing throats were policy, the empire would be safe forever. Suspension arrives first. In 1883, the state effectively halts the operation of the acts in the subjected districts. 3 years later, in 1886, repeal passes. The gates of the lock hospitals do not fly off their hinges with a cheer. They simply open and close according to new rules, quieter, less certain, and more accountable to consent than they were the week before. Health officials do not evaporate. Clinics continue to exist. What changes is the principle that a woman can be seized by suspicion and forced beneath a cold lamp for the good of men who will never see the inside of that room. After repeal, attention shifts toward voluntary treatment, education, and the awkward truth that shame is a terrible tool for public health. Leaflets attempt straightforward advice. Charities push for clinics that do not ask first for character references. There is a slow turn toward confidentiality, though the habit of moralizing dies with great reluctance. Historians still argue whether the repeal movement achieved a lasting change in attitudes, or mostly moved enforcement into subtler forms that would reappear in future regulations. You keep the question open because honesty prefers daylight to certainties that do not fit. You step back onto the street and let the morning widen. A baker opens his shop, and the smell of new bread makes the hospital behind you feel even colder by contrast. A sailor carries a loaf under his arm and hums a tune about home that would sound brave if it were not so tired. A woman in a clean shawl passes with her head high and her hands steady. She is not a symbol or a statistic. She is a person who knows the price of soap and the shape of fear. If respectability were sold by the pound, there would still be a queue halfway to the docks. You walk on counting steps, because counting offers a harmless illusion of order. The acts remain in your mind as a lesson about what happens when policy forgets the dignity of the individual and worships the safety of a system that looks tidy on paper. The quiet of the hospital gate lingers together with the hope that care can learn to speak without coercion. The city exhales, and you let your shoulders soften. The morning is brighter than the file in the clerk's hand, and that for now feels like a victory measured in inches. You step into a consulting room where curtains mute the daylight, and shelves line up bottles that glow the color of old honey. A brass clock hums. The physician adjusts his cuffs with the care of a man who enjoys the ritual of neatness. You can feel the drama that medical rooms invite. People enter with problems too knotted to name, and hope that Latin, glass, and confidence can unknot them. The word hysteria slides across the carpet like a well-trained cat. It is everywhere and nowhere. A diagnosis that manages to fit sleeplessness, headaches, fainting, irritability, and the general condition of being a woman who does not conform to the timetable of the household. In the 19th century, hysteria is a common diagnostic label in Britain and across Europe, invoked for a wide constellation of complaints and linked in older theory to the womb through classical ideas that linger longer than they should. At teaching hospitals, you may hear the name Charcot, see sketches of convulsions on lecture handouts, and watch young physicians attempt to pin an elusive butterfly to a card called science. They do not agree on causes. They do agree that hysteria makes for excellent case notes. The physician in this room has a manner that blends fatherly patience with professional gravity. He asks about appetite, digestion, sleep, and the new electricity that everyone mentions, as if it can charge a person the way it charges a lamp. He writes prescriptions for rest, for seaside air, for interestingly tasteless tonics. Then he mentions massage with a voice that belongs to upholstery. The word paroxysm appears as if it was simply another symptom to be arranged by the clock. You feel the strangeness of a cure that depends on what no one can say aloud. You study the instruments on a side table. Here is a hand-cranked device that resembles a sewing machine mated with a teetotaler's conscience. Here is a wand with a rubber tip that fits into an electrical handle. The cord snakes to a battery box disguised with walnut veneer, because healing prefers to look domestic when companies want to sell it for the home. Another instrument waits inside a velvet-lined case, all polished nickel and intent. Some catalogues advertise steam-driven massage machines for surgeries with leather belts, pedals, and a flywheel that rumbles like a tidy locomotive. The room would warm, a window would fog, and the doctor could say he was treating fatigue while the device did the talking. The language around all this becomes a careful shelter. Doctors record hysterical paroxysm the way meteorologists record cloudbursts, brief and cleansing, expected to improve mood and reduce restlessness. Patients who can afford private rooms receive regular appointments. Patients who cannot afford them are told to rest, to knit, to avoid spicy foods, and to cultivate calm as if it were parsley on a windowsill. If serenity were an herb, every chemist would sell bouquets by the bushel, and the city would smell like a salad. Electricity turns the consultation into a showroom. Induction coils whisper, brushes crackle faintly. Advertisements promise that current properly tamed will firm nerves and discipline wandering pains. Ladies' journals, cautious but curious, run tiny notices for personal massagers that never once say what muscles they intend to soothe. Mail-order firms brag about discretion. Brown paper, plain invoices, a postman who will not blink. You can feel a new kind of commerce, thriving in the space between silence and need. Late Victorian inventors patent a variety of electromechanical massagers that reached domestic markets by the 1890s, promoted as general health appliances and as assistants for medical practice. The ads avoid explicit claims, yet the euphemisms perform like acrobats that never tumble. One inventor insists his percussion hammer treats muscular stiffness, another suggests relief of nervous troubles, and a third lets the illustration do the louder work. You recognize the sturdy partnership between engineering and hope. Not every physician favors machinery. Some insist on manual techniques and say that skill matters more than metal. Others warn that devices encourage laziness and produce artificial results. The argument sounds scientific and also personal. They are certainly human. With each debate, the room collects more euphemism until even the curtains feel complicit. Historians still argue whether manual pelvic massage to induce paroxysm was common in ordinary British practices or mainly confined to a subset later exaggerated by sensational accounts that turned rumour into certainty. The record keeps its counsel because discretion leaves fewer receipts than pride. Quackery buzzes at the edges, like a persistent bluebottle. Electric belts promise to realign life itself. Corsets, laced with tiny coils, claim to revitalize the womb with galvanic whispers. Pulvermacher chains strung like metallic rosaries promise to drape vigor where chemistry has failed. The testimonials read as if dictated by a very enthusiastic uncle. If electricity truly restored virtue on contact, every lamppost would be a confessional and half the city would hug pylons before breakfast. Clinics construct routines that sound hygienic to the point of liturgy. An appointment begins with a mild current, continues with massage, concludes with a tonic and advice to avoid excessive novels. The doctor's hands are steady, the clock kindly, the paper screen held like a shield against embarrassment. Patients describe improvement in terms that hover between relief and diplomacy. Some likely do feel better, whether from release, attention, or the placebo effect that medicine pretends to dislike while benefiting from it daily. Others feel sold to, then vanish to try the sea. You watch a technician polish a nickel attachment until he can see his own face in it. The shine is not vain. Metal must be smooth, if skin is to leave the room unmarked. The hospital porter carries a crate to the basement full of replacement parts and things that rattle without description. Machines break, which is both a nuisance and a mercy, since repairs give staff time to remember that intimacy blended with power asks for caution. The best practitioners already know this. They look their patients in the eye and remember the person who brought the symptom to the door. Law hovers like a schoolmaster who prefers not to grade the assignment. Official censors prefer print to behave and products to remain vague. Some devices pass as general massagers. Others find themselves detained by customs on the suspicion that health can become an alibi too easily. Meanwhile, the trade finds a way. Tobacconists keep catalogues under counters. Sewing machine sellers moonlight as agents for electrical novelties, because a household that accepts motors near fabric will accept motors near flesh once language becomes soft enough. In the lecture halls, young men in black coats watch demonstrations of hysteria that include hypnosis, suggestion, and the theatre of the nervous system made visible. They take notes that read like plays. They also whisper jokes that are not as good as they think. One or two will learn to listen with real patience, to ask better questions, to wonder whether the pain speaks of marriage, money, or the arithmetic of a life that offers too many duties and too little rest. If empathy could be bottled, a splash before rounds would improve medical outcomes faster than any tonic with iron. The home appliance creeps closer to the sitting room. Manufacturers promise quiet motors, rubber fittings, safety switches, and handsome boxes that hide under ottomans. A lady can claim she has acquired a new aid for complexion, for circulation, for the prevention of neuralgia, which is a word that stretches to cover many mysteries. The salesman never says more than a murmur. The customer never asks more than a nod. Money changes hands. Privacy takes care of the rest. You leave the consulting room and the air outside tastes fresher than it should. The city cracks with invention and need. That old duet. A street organ plays a tune that pretends cheerfulness. The sky looks like tinned blue. You walk with the sense that medicine, for all its charts and clamps, is still learning how to treat discomfort that lives both in the body and in the rules that squeeze it. Machines will multiply, theories will molt, and people will continue to search for a vocabulary that lets care be honest without inviting a knock at the door. For now, the clock in that room keeps humming, and the ledger fills with tidy lines that try to make a science out of size. You pause before a shop window piled with umbrellas, bicycle tires, and something labeled rubber sundries that pretends to be about rainy weather and squeaky pumps. Inside, the bell gives a polite tinkle, and the clerk appears with the calm of a person who can discuss anything without blinking. Shelves hold bottles of scented soap, syringes with polished nozzles, little boxes marked hygienic appliances, and folded pamphlets that look as dull as tax advice. Your fingertip skims a card that reads marital requisites in neat italics. The room smells of vulcanized rubber and lavender sachets, a combination far more suggestive than either scent alone. After Charles Goodyear patents vulcanization in the 1840s, rubber becomes durable and elastic enough for everyday products. By the mid-19th century, manufacturers in Britain and on the continent turn out rubber condoms sold as reusable sheaths. Earlier versions made from animal membranes still exist, washed and powdered between uses, but the rubber variety enters shop drawers and mail parcels with brisk modern energy. A clerk can discuss sizes with the seriousness of a tailor, and tie the purchase in paper so discreet that even a nosy aunt would shrug. Language does most of the heavy lifting. You hear the phrase French letters whispered with a mix of bravado and embarrassment. Advertisements speak of safeguards for married life, appliances for ensuring tranquility, preventives for the thoughtful or simple rubber goods. For women, the euphemisms multiply. Pessaries become uterine supporters. Douches become hygienic syringes. Sponges are advertised as travel companions, which is an adventure you are in no hurry to book. The coded vocabulary feels like a polite waltz. Everyone knows which steps to take. No one names the tune out loud. A demonstration model of a syringe sits in a glass case. The clerk explains its virtues in a tone fit for a tea lecture. He recommends a mild solution after marital congress to promote cleanliness and comfort. You can hear the blank space where he declines to say contraception. Some customers ask for a Higginson syringe by name, made popular as a general household irrigator, then wink so hard you worry for their eyelids. Historians still argue whether dosing was widely relied upon in practice, or merely one of many hopeful rituals promoted by vendors. The medical reality is glum. Timing and chemistry rarely cooperate enough to make it reliable. Hope, however, never runs out of stock. You pick up a pamphlet titled A Guide to Wedlock and the Healthy Home. The prose wears a top hat. It counsels moderation, mutual regard, temperate meals, and the avoidance of saucy novels. Between those sentences, it hides advice about intervals and methods. Never quite finishing a sentence, it begins. A second pamphlet pretends to be a treatise on Malthusian prudence, a phrase that carries the authority of a lecture and the heartbeat of a budget. You can picture a couple by lamplight, choosing between another mouth and the new pair of shoes that might make walking to work feel like less of a punishment. The pamphlet promises arithmetic for the body. The body rarely behaves. In 1877, Annie Besant and Charles Bradlaugh publish a cheap edition of Charles Knowlton's Fruits of Philosophy, a manual that includes information on contraception. They are prosecuted for obscenity. The trial becomes a spectacle. The verdict convicts them initially, yet legal wrangling and public pressure shift outcomes, and the case helps crack open British debates about what information the public may read. You imagine the jury listening to medical testimony delivered in a voice that could starch linen. You imagine a bookseller wondering if his window will survive the week. Mail order becomes its own theatre. A tobacconist quietly hands you a catalogue printed on faintly glossy paper. It offers pessaries, sheaths, crim caps, sponges with silk threads, and bottles of antiseptic fluid, whose labels promise purity with more confidence than chemistry can supply. Orders arrive in plain envelopes that travel through the post office with faces straight as constables. The invoice describes hardware or rubber fittings. A return address reads simply, "The Warehouse," which is both everywhere and nowhere. If discretion earned frequent buyer points, half the city could holiday in Margate for free. The boundary between medicine and merchandise blurs. Some doctors recommend mechanical means with a sigh, convinced that misery baked into overcrowded homes is worse for morality than prudence practiced in private. Others condemn everything that smells of prevention and prescribe abstinence with the optimism of a man who never shared a bed in a cold room. One physician suggests the safe period, converting a menstrual calendar into a geometry problem. Another sells a womb veil, a little cap that promises to intercept consequences. Historians still argue whether these methods spread chiefly through secular reformers, through midwives and neighborhood networks, or through the commercial push of rubber shops. The surviving evidence is patchy because the most truthful conversations happen between people who never expected to be footnoted. Quackery thrives like ivy. Electric belts offer to invigorate organs that do not require electricity. Tonics with names like Mother's Friend or Marital Harmony Tonic appear in ads that never mention ingredients and always mention testimonials. One potion boasts a clove of secrecy in every bottle. Another boasts German science, which turns out to be 3 pages of Latin labels and a heroic amount of alcohol. If enthusiasm had a proof rating, these bottles would set the table on fire. You notice how the trade leans on care as a cover. Some women seek syringes to treat infections that have nothing to do with prevention. Some couples want pessaries to support a prolapsed organ after childbirth. The same shelf holds honest relief and speculative promises. A widow asks for a remedy for troublesome flux. A bride asks for something to keep her complexion fresh. The clerk knows how to unpack both requests without unpacking too much. Language keeps everyone steady. Condoms themselves change shape and quality as techniques improve. Early rubber ones are thick, have seams, and can be washed, dried on a mold, and sprinkled with starch before the next use. Later, dipping methods produce thinner versions that feel more like a thoughtful compromise than an agricultural implement. Packaging grows prettier. Some brands stamp reassuring lions or anchors on the wrapper, a national emblem for a very private voyage. Men debate thickness the way they debate boot black, a conversation that sounds practical until you realize it is also pride in disguise. In newspapers, coded ads slalom between censors. A small classified offers a marriage manual from a respectable address. Another promises French preventive letters to gentlemen of prudence. The printer places them beside advertisements for pianoforte lessons and cures for corns, as if life could be sorted by alphabet and need. Occasionally, a magistrate makes an example and seizes a bundle of pamphlets. The case produces a week of righteous headlines. Then the headlines need new prey. Trade resumes in whispers, audible to anyone who listens. You meet a midwife who carries her instruments in a black bag with scuffed corners. She gives frank advice couched in gentleness. She recommends sponges tied with ribbon for easy retrieval, not because they are perfect, but because they are under the user's control. She does not love the douches except for cleanliness. She knows that mistakes happen even in careful homes, and that a family saved from one more mouth might avoid the workhouse. Her voice holds no sermon. It holds experience, which tends to be the better teacher. The neo-Malthusian conversation gathers in small rooms above printers and in private parlors that smell of tea and damp wool. Pamphlets argue that knowledge is moral, because it relieves suffering. Opponents claim that knowledge invites temptation and erodes character. The debate turns on whether duty means filling a nation with hungry children or arranging births to match wages and walls. Historians still argue whether contraceptive practice expanded quickly or crept slowly in the Victorian decades. Demographic curves tell one story, while diaries and police records tell another. The numbers decline noticeably later, yet the seeds of choice are planted in these quiet transactions. You let the clerk wrap a bottle of antiseptic and a perfectly innocent hairbrush in the same paper, then step into the street with a packet that looks like rain insurance. A handbill curls on the curb, advertising a lecture on domestic science that will probably smuggle in 3 pages of practical counsel between recipes for broth. If good sense were a seasoning, every household would put it on the table and ask for seconds. You walk past a row of windows where washing hangs like white flags, and you think about the small negotiations that keep children fed and rooms tolerable. There is nothing grand in any of it. There is nothing heroic beyond the quiet decision to learn and to plan in a culture that prefers silence. Rubber, cloth, calendars, bottles, pamphlets, and the steady hands of people who refuse to blush become a toolkit built piece by piece. The city keeps selling, warning, arguing, and pretending. Behind the arguments leaves a stubborn wish for control over consequences. You breathe, tuck the parcel deeper under your arm, and keep walking with the sense that practical knowledge is a lantern that casts a narrow but honest circle of light. You pause in a print shop where the front table groans under sermons, travel guides, and a very serious atlas. The proprietor polishes his spectacles, as if shine alone can keep trouble away. A boy sweeps in slow circles. Somewhere in the back, a press sighs, metal on paper, the sound of argument turning into objects. You ask for a catalogue and receive 2, one for the window and one that arrives with a lowered voice. The second lists medical treatises, continental novels, and educational dialogues, each title surrounded by a mote of euphemism. You can feel the temperature of the room drop a degree when law becomes the next subject to enter. The Obscene Publications Act of 1857 gives British authorities new power to seize materials judged obscene and destroy them by order of a magistrate. Its edges are undefined enough to cut whoever holds the book at the wrong moment. 11 years later, in 1868, the Court of Queen's Bench decides Regina versus Hicklin, a case that produces a standard used for decades. Material may be suppressed if, taken by itself and not as a whole, it tends to deprave and corrupt those whose minds are open to such influences. The phrasing is careful and dangerous. A single passage can doom an entire volume. The hypothetical vulnerable reader becomes the measure, not the person who actually bought the book. You turn the catalogue in your hands and feel the logic close like a trap that politely asks your name before it snaps. A pamphlet of medical advice that mentions anatomy too clearly can be seized on the ground, that a curious boy might read it. A poem that blushes at its own metaphors can be judged unsafe for someone imagined by a clerk in a bad mood. Printers learn to rethink punctuation, as if commas could save reputations. Publishers sift manuscripts, as though searching for gunpowder in a cake. Some sellers slip suggestive works into false covers stamped with soothing titles such as Parish Sermons or Mornings in Italy. One favorite disguise is a medical handbook with a dull green cloth binding, because no policeman enjoys explaining why he opened a book about chilblains and indigestion. Historians still argue whether these jackets were widespread policy or mostly the stunts of a few clever dealers. Yet several surviving copies bear suspiciously misfitted spines that tell their own joke. Even morality enjoys a costume party when it must. Magistrates lean on Hicklin as on a walking stick. They read a page or two aloud in court, while juries stare at the ceiling to look serious. The test allows a judge to ignore context, intention, and audience. A physiological text aimed at doctors can be condemned as a threat to kitchen maids. A literary novel translated from French can be denounced because one chapter contains a kiss that lingers and a sentence that does not repent. You can see how easily the line between protection and prudery softens in the rain. The police conduct raids that feel like theatrical strikes. A constable walks into a Holywell Street shop with a warrant tucked into his cap. He climbs a narrow stair, opens a press, and pulls out a stack of brown paper parcels tied with string. Downstairs, the proprietor mutters he had no idea what those parcels contained, and that they belong to a cousin who is always unreliable about rent. The boy stopping the press looks as if he has swallowed a tack. If innocence were a hat, every bookseller would own 3 sizes and wear all of them at once. In 1888, the publisher Henry the Vistelli is prosecuted for issuing English translations of Émile Zola. Critics claim the novels are corrupting. The court agrees. Fines and eventual imprisonment follow when he persists, and the books are suppressed. It is not a question of literacy. Zola can write. It is a question of whether frankness about human bodies and desires can exist in British print without first dressing itself in a sermon. The case chills publishers who thought translation might shelter under cultural respectability. Censors never admit to enjoying their work. They speak of duty, of protecting the young, of keeping vice from colonizing breakfast tables. The Hicklin test makes their burden lighter by giving them a wide net that does not require many knots. They can seize pages for what they might do to a possible reader, instead of what they have actually done in the world. Historians still argue whether the test merely codified an existing moral temperature or actively cooled the culture by teaching writers to trim and hedge. You can prove both with examples, which is a clever trick and no consolation. Printers adapt with a speed that would impress an engineer. Some publish Baudelarized editions where adjectives take early retirement. Others relocate editions to France, then smuggle copies back wrapped with catalogues for gloves. A few mastermind subscription clubs where volumes travel by private promise rather than public advertisement. Codes bloom like moss. Literary works become art in catalogues when the customs house grows nosy. Medical titles lean on phrases like "for professional use only," hoping that italic letters will act as bodyguards. The test tugs at scientific and educational publishing in curious ways. Anatomy plates gain drapery that would have startled their original artists. A midwifery manual swaps direct diagrams for shy cross-sections. A lecturer clears his throat before every clinical term, and hopes the young men in the front row will stop giggling long enough to learn something useful. If embarrassment could sterilize instruments, every operating theatre would sparkle without a drop of carbolic. Courts become classrooms where moralists and free speech advocates rehearse their best lines. Prosecutors read the worst passage aloud as if the rest of the book never happened. Defenders plead for the whole, invoke purpose, gesture at the halo of literature. The judge quotes Hicklin, and the matter returns to that single question about tendency to deprave. The role of the imagined vulnerable reader becomes so prominent that you wonder whether the wisest course is to ban imagination altogether, a plan that collapses the moment anyone looks out a window. Hicklin also touches the import trade. Customs officers riffle through crates from Paris and Brussels with professional suspicion. They look for paper of a particular sheen, for bindings that flex too easily, for plates printed on separate stock and slipped in late. Seizures fill storerooms that smell of damp pasteboard and bruised ink. Appeals drag on. Some items are quietly returned after months, a victory that tastes like stale bread. Others feed the furnace. Paper burns very brightly when it is printed with someone else's daring. Writers and artists play with the edges. They experiment with allegory and coded metaphor. They hide desire in pastoral scenes where sheep graze with suspicious industry. They construct sentences that pretend to discuss the weather and somehow leave readers flushed. Cleverness becomes a survival skill. Yet, there are costs. A generation learns cautious habits that outlive the law itself. That is how standards work. They move in and take the spare bedroom. You hear a school teacher argue that the test serves children who deserve slow steps into adult knowledge. You hear a reformer argue that the same test starves teenagers of honest information and leaves them prey to rumor. Both speak with conviction. Historians still argue whether censorship prevented harm or created it by pushing questions into alleys where the worst answers wait. The truth does not love neatness, yet the law often insists on it. Publishers whisper about tricks that never make it into official memoirs. Some move risky chapters to the back where a casual reader will not flip. Some print small runs under neutral imprints, then gauge reaction before daring a bigger splash. A few keep two settings of type, one clean and one spicy, swapping in a paragraph according to the destination. If moral temperature could be measured in pickers, a compositor would be the nation's weatherman. You take the air outside, and the street feels taller than a minute ago. Shop windows keep their faces straight. A newsboy hawks a story about a book seized at the docks, and the crowd laughs as if scandal were an afternoon treat. The Hicklin test continues quietly in the minds of writers who now read their own drafts as if a magistrate were peering over their shoulder. A sentence becomes a corridor. A metaphor becomes a locked door. The city keeps buying paper. The courts keep buying ink. Between them, printers weigh risk against rent and decide how loudly a page may breathe. You step into a dressmaker's workroom that smells of steam, starch, and ambition. Mannequins in half-finished bodices stand like conspirators around a table. Ribbons curl in saucers, and a strip of steel busk glints beside a pile of bone-colored stays that once belonged to a whale, and now belong to the geometry of fashion. A fitter beckons you toward a high-backed chair, and loosens a length of lacing until it looks like a pale ladder. You understand at once that clothing here is not simply fabric, it is architecture. The city may be built of brick, but many of its desires are engineered with satin and eyelets. In the 19th century, corsets are ordinary garments for most middle-class and upper working-class women, evolving from whalebone to steel, from back lacing only to convenient fronting busks that allow quicker dressing. By the 1870s, the spoon busk appears to smooth the front and distribute pressure. Debates about health shadow the fashion. Doctors warn of compressed lungs and displaced organs. Advertisers reply with health corsets cut to flatter a physician's conscience. You can hear the arguments stitched into every scene. The ritual of lacing becomes a small theatre. The wearer grips a bedpost, exhales, and the lasso draws evenly from the waist loops until the figure becomes an hourglass drawn in real time. The room hushes the way rooms do when people concentrate. The last tug is not brutal. It is calibrated. The bow is tied, tucked, and smoothed under a placket. You notice how control itself becomes a texture. A skirt hooks to a bodice. A jacket sets the line. The mirror reports success with cool honesty. If patients collected wages, the person doing the lacing could retire to the seaside on buttons alone. Corset makers speak a language of bones and curves. They discuss steels that remember shape, cording that resists stress, gussets that forgive posture after luncheon. Some clients request ventilated panels with tiny perforations that form starry constellations across the fabric. Others prefer heavy satin that turns a torso into polished grammar. The tape measure clicks in the fitter's hand. Numbers become promises. You can feel how promises invite attention, the kind that lingers over a waist where the laces cross like a secret map. Boots join the lesson with their own rights. Ankle boots sit on a shelf like a lineup of polished punctuation. High-button boots lean with shy arrogance. Dozens of buttons marching up the side like little soldiers who never blink. A button hook rests nearby, curved and efficient, stamped with an advertisement for soap. The clerk demonstrates the hook with a tidy flourish, one button after another until the leather hugs the calf with the finality of a vow. Merchants give away branded button hooks as promotions, because anyone who has done up 30 buttons at speed will never forget the shop that saved their fingertips. Historians still argue whether such giveaways were common practice across London, or mostly a clever trend in certain fashionable districts, but surviving hooks in drawers suggest generosity paired neatly with marketing. Shiny leather earns its own private congregation. Cobblers offer mirror finishes that reflect a person back in miniature, and the gleam carries the suggestion that superiority can be polished into existence. Boot blacks in the Strand work with an artistry that borders on obsession, coaxing a depth of shine that looks almost wet and smells faintly of wax and triumph. A regular arrives, places a boot on the stand, and watches the gloss rise like the moon. You observe the hunger in that gaze. It is not only vanity, it is fascination with control made visible at your feet. The fetish is not a word anyone says aloud, yet the evidence threads through the city like a ribbon tucked under a bodice. Magazines fill with fashion plates that linger on waists so narrow they could share a neckline with a decanter. Novels purr over neat ankles and the flash of a boot as a heroine enters a carriage. Photographs crop at the waist or the calf, letting the viewer complete the story without help. You begin to read the code. Laces mean intimacy without confession. Buttons suggest patience rewarded by proximity. Leather stands for power contained in a manageable field of shine. Tailors and dressmakers assemble props that heighten the ritual. Corset covers with tiny pearl buttons. Silk stockings with clocks stitched at the ankle that point toward the boot as if announcing a performance. Garters that snap with the quiet authority of a well-made hinge. A client may pretend that these are all about silhouette and line. The mirror knows better. The mirror does not tattletale, but it notices the glimmer of thrill that arrives when structure and skin meet politely. The silhouette shifts across the century. Crinolines dominate the 1850s and early 1860s, then give way to bustles, especially in the 1870s and 1880s, which push fullness backward while the waist narrows visually. Corset shapes follow, the waist dropping slightly, the hips springing differently, the bust supported by new pattern pieces. Manufacturers like Symington expand production, and advertise standardized sizes while still offering custom cuts. The industry professionalizes. The private attention that clients pay to details does not diminish. If anything, specialization gives the fascination more corners to grip. Shop talk contains little debates that echo the larger world. Tight lacing versus gentle support. Stays for adolescence versus patience until growth is done. The lasser claims 2 inches are safe with practice. The doctor frowns and brings a diagram. The wearer weighs poise against comfort, and decides that confidence itself is a form of support. Historians still argue whether extreme tight lacing was truly common daily wear or mainly a fantasy magnified by satirists and scandal sheets. Surviving corsets with moderate waists suggest practicality, living alongside aspiration, which is usually how people arrange their wardrobes and their lives. Boot sellers refine measurements with the focus of navigators plotting a coast. Lasts are carved to individual quirks. Elastic-sided boots appear, promising ease without sacrificing shape. Yet the buttoned pair keeps its following, perhaps because it turns dressing into ceremony, and ceremony has a way of feeling like importance. You watch a woman raise her skirt just enough to fasten the top 3 buttons. The gesture is not exhibition, it is ownership. If gravity were charged admission at that hemline, it would still not get a seat. The materials tell their own biographies. Whalebone creaks quietly like an old sailor. Steel whispers and holds a secret longer. Leather behaves like a proud pupil that thrives under polish. Silk plays well with light and refuses to behave with dust. A seamstress strokes a length of couture, as if it were a dependable friend. A cobbler folds a strip of kid leather in his palm to test its memory. These crafts do not advertise their intimacy with desire, yet they learn it in the course of long workdays. Tools that sit close to skin acquire knowledge by proximity. Etiquette pretends to preside. Ladies are advised to lace moderately, to sit without creasing, to avoid the scandal of an unlaced hour. Gentlemen are advised to admire without staring. Everyone ignores everyone else's advice as circumstances require. A chaperone notices boots before she notices faces. A poet writes a sonnet to a pair of shoes and quickly changes the nouns in case the manuscript strays. If secrets paid rent, half the wardrobes in London would put landlords out of business. You try on a measuring tape like a sash, and understand the spell. The numbers offer certainty. The reflection offers an edited version of truth. The laces, the gloss, the snug hug of leather make the body feel like a project, not a problem. That sensation travels further than fashion. It becomes a private liturgy. Lace, breathe, button, smooth, check the mirror, step into the day, on the street, polished boots, click on stone with a tempo that pleases the ear. A passerby glances down involuntarily at the gleam, and then straight ahead with a face that says nothing at all. Factories puff steam while backrooms whisper. Catalogues promise ease and elegance. Doctors publish warnings, writers publish winks. The seamstress keeps sewing because rent cares little for debates about morale or morals. In the end, a pair of laces can feel like reins held by steady hands. A strip of leather can feel like armor that shines instead of clanks. Whatever word the culture prefers to avoid, the attention lavished on these objects becomes its own quiet confession. You leave the workroom imagining the small ceremonies repeated in thousands of rooms at dawn and dusk. Each bow tied with a practiced tug that turns cloth and leather into a vow kept close to the skin. You walk on with your hands empty and your head full of tiny pictures that other people will never see, which is perhaps the cleanest way to collect them. You follow a queue into a townhouse where curtains are drawn at noon, and the hallway smells of beeswax and violets. A maid with very soft footsteps collects coins in a saucer. Visitors carry the sort of alert politeness people bring to weddings and train timetables. The sitting room glows in gaslight turned low, chairs in a circle, table in the middle like an altar that swore it would behave. The medium arrives with a shawl, a calm voice, and the careful eyes of a person who can hear a cough and tell you which handkerchief pocket it came from. You take a seat and let your palms rest on the table as instructed. Tonight, the living will ask the dead for their schedules. Spiritualism explodes into British parlours in the 1850s, after earlier rapping phenomena in America. By the 1860s and 1870s, the country hosts public circles, private circles, and touring performers who promise messages, materializations, and music from beyond. Famous names hover over the candle flame. Daniel Douglas Home is known for levitations witnessed by titled spectators. The Davenport brothers travel with a spirit cabinet and ropes that never seem to keep them still. The Society for Psychical Research forms in London in 1882 to investigate such claims with experiments and notebooks, an institution that tries to make calm out of candlelight. The medium asks everyone to link fingers. The room exhales. A cabinet in the corner waits with its doors a little ajar. The table begins to tremble. The first polite tap of a teacup that wants attention. Someone whispers a name into the air. Then another. A bell rings under the table where no one can reach without admitting it. You feel the crowd leaning toward belief, as if toward a fire, a sensation equal parts warmth and wish. If curiosity came with seatbelts, this circle would buckle up twice. The choreography is simple. Singing to build harmony. Quiet questions. Then the soft morse of taps for yes or no. A slate rests on the table, a bit of chalk imprisoned between its leaves. When the slates are opened, a sentence curls across the surface in a hand nobody recognizes, and everybody wants to. The medium smiles without claiming credit. A trumpet on the floor lifts, turns gently, and produces a breathy hello that sounds like a shell lifted from the shore. You cannot help thinking about stagecraft. You also cannot help feeling something walk up your arm when the trumpet passes overhead and the air goes sweet and cold. Some mediums dab luminous paint on fingertip gloves or on the edges of a gauze veil, so that in the dark a wavering hand or a floating strip of cloth can sketch a ghost in the air. The effect is modest and persuasive, exactly the sort that invites the mind to finish the picture. Historians still argue whether certain famous cabinets were fitted with trap panels and wires from the start, or merely adapted by clever hands as reputations grew. The cabinets themselves are often handsome furniture, which means suspicion has to wrestle with good carpentry. Names drift that carry the weight of reputations and arguments. William Crookes, an eminent scientist, investigates mediums in the 1870s and writes cautiously about phenomena he claims to have witnessed under test conditions. Critics reply with lists of ways a nimble person could achieve similar effects. Admirers insist the witnesses were too serious to be fooled. The medium in your room does not mention scientists, only spirits, and the glow on her cheekbones looks like part stagecraft and part conviction. Historians still argue whether certain investigators fell in love with their own patients or simply lacked the craft knowledge that a theatre hand takes for granted. Ectoplasm becomes the word nobody says before the tea arrives. It appears like gauze from a mouth or a sleeve, pale, sticky, sometimes printed suspiciously like cheesecloth with a memory of the loom. Sitters gasp. The medium sways. Someone cries softly from relief or from nerves, and no one asks which. Later, skeptics will point out that a bolt of bannermaker's muslin can fit into a cabinet drawer, and that a thread tied cleverly can tug a curtain in the right direction. Believers will point to the tremor that goes through a person when grief finally finds something that looks like a hand. The business model is delicate. Private circles promise authenticity and quiet. Public halls promise spectacle and ticket prices. Mediums learn to manage expectations the way restaurants manage seasonal menus. You cannot serve a trumpet in every course. Sitters often bring locks of hair or photographs to nudge the conversation. The medium touches the keepsake, shudders with admirable restraint, and says a sentence that only the person who brought it could interpret, which is exactly how all intimate language functions. If ambiguity were a currency, this room would never worry about rent. Skeptics organize tests with visible controls. They tie the medium's hands with seals on the knots. They sprinkle flour on the floor to catch footprints. They place a ring at the cabinet door, and claim they will hear its jingle if anyone steps past. The ring jingles anyway, perhaps from a thread or from a movement so light the flour sighs but does not smudge. People leave the experiment more deeply persuaded of whatever they believed when they entered. That is a reliable outcome in almost every field where human hope is the apparatus. Slate writing sits at the center of many sittings in these decades. Messages produced between two slates pressed together, and sometimes tied or sealed with the medium's hands ostensibly visible. Exposure literature teaches tricks for this, including hidden chalk, prepared slates, and misdirection with lighting and voice. Some spiritualists admit that frauds exist and urge stricter tests, while insisting the presence of rogues does not cancel the honest. The debate becomes a hall of mirrors in which every reflection looks like the other, unless you know where to stand. Money brushes the curtain again. Reputable mediums keep books with appointments, not names. A hostess arranges private evenings for select guests, and earns gratitude that spends like influence. A printer sells hymn sheets with lyrics tweaked for the departed. A supplier offers folding cabinets and collapsible trumpets for circles that travel. You sense a cottage industry with padded feet, all very quiet, until a scandal shakes a parish, at which point everyone loudly remembers they had doubts all along. The atmosphere itself does half the work. Darkness removes embarrassment and invites imagination. Soft singing bends breathing into a shared rhythm. The medium's voice glides toward a register that sounds like a remembered aunt. A hand brushes your sleeve and tells you a relative forgives or thanks or understands. You notice later that the message fit more than one person in the room, which is not proof of trickery, only of the human habit of hearing our own name inside a general blessing. If reassurance had a factory stamp, you would find it on every séance trumpet and every lullaby. Not all rooms are tranquil. Some turn rowdy when a sitter demands names and dates like a bailiff. Others turn dangerous when candles flare near gauze, and a cabinet threatens to demonstrate the non-spiritual properties of flame. Mediums carry sewing kits for repairs to veils, and for the occasional sitter who faints so gracefully a hem must be let out afterward. On quiet nights, the only drama is a table that tilts just enough to make people lean, a lesson in physics that wears a sentimental coat. You step out when the door opens for fresh air, eyes stinging a little from heat and close company. The street feels larger than a minute ago. Somewhere a concertina plays a tune that sounds like a question mark. The mind, you realize, likes answers that arrive with soft edges that call themselves visitors rather than verdicts. People bring grief to these rooms and longing and the ache of choices they will never unmake. The medium offers a script in which love conquers separation for the price of an evening and a coin. Historians still argue whether the whole movement reflects cynical exploitation, sincere belief, or a blend that changes hour by hour. You cannot settle the argument standing on the pavement. You do know this. Dark rooms make light behave like a magician, and suggestion makes memory show its better photographs. In that twilight, a veil can float, a trumpet can whisper, a chalk mark can turn into a message, and hearts that have been tightening for years can loosen for a few minutes. You walk away feeling both charmed and weary, which is perhaps the only honest way to leave a place where evidence and desire share a chair. The night closes around you with the gentleness of velvet handled carefully by a patient hand. You move through a reading room that smells of old vellum and secrets, where classical busts stare at the door as if they were hired to screen visitors. A young man lowers his eyes from a volume of Horace, another traces a line in Plato, and does not turn the page for several minutes. You recognize the stage props of discretion. Greek texts, careful diction, an extra coat of courtesy over everything. The word Uranian arrives softly, borrowed from continental theory that speaks of Aphrodite Urania, and a love between men framed as elevated, intellectual and stubbornly real. The label feels like a cloak that can pass as a scholar's robe in daylight. In 1885, Parliament passes the Criminal Law Amendment Act, often called the Labouchere Amendment, which criminalizes acts of gross indecency between male persons, whether in public or private. The statute makes prosecution easier and increases the reach of police and blackmailers alike. The law does not mention women, a silence that has its own story, but for men, it places a hard border around what already lived in shadow. Your shoulders lift when you picture a ledger where morality is inked as chargeable offense. You find a letter tucked inside a slim book, its handwriting small and tidy. Speaking of comradeship, of the soul recognized in another face, of a walk taken at dusk so no one will ask why two silhouettes keep the same pace too long. The phrasing circles classical ideals and lands in ordinary tenderness. This is the private voice of the Uranian circle, at least the part that fits into paper without setting alarms ringing. To outsiders, the style looks like a school exercise. To insiders, it reads like an address that leads to a door behind a library shelf. You follow footpaths that men of this persuasion learn by heart. There are clubs where glances last one breath longer than manners allow. There are Turkish baths with tiled rooms warm enough to steam caution off a collar, where conversation hums in low vowels and names are not requested. There are parks that grow more talkative after midnight, and certain music halls where a particular raised eyebrow means hello in a grammar not printed anywhere. In the 1890s, green carnations briefly bloom in buttonholes after a novelist teases the symbol in a satire, and a certain famous playwright toys with the fashion. Historians still argue whether the flower ever functioned as a reliable sign among men seeking men, or was simply a theatrical joke that the city adopted for a season. On writing desks, poems appear that praise friendship with an intensity that causes a few eyebrows to arch and then fall again. Some use myth to hide what the heart insists. Ganymede pours wine that is obviously not about grapes. Hyacinth dies again and again, so that grief can be admired for its diction. The verses travel by hand rather than by bookshop. You can feel the mix of pride and fear in the neatness of the copies. A reader who understands will not need the underlining. A reader who does not will fold the page and admire the handwriting. John Addington Symonds writes privately about love between men, corresponds with allies, and drafts material that later becomes part of Havelock Ellis's study, Sexual Inversion, in the 1890s. Early British publication meets legal trouble, and copies are withdrawn, a chilly example of how print can be seized while conversations continue. The medical language helps some readers call themselves a type rather than a sin. It also pins moth wings with scientific pins. You watch how labels offer shelter, and then start rearranging the furniture. Networks grow from the smallest courtesies. A sympathetic bookseller nudges a customer toward volumes with Greek boys on the spine. A schoolmaster warns a promising student to keep his mouth ahead of his eyes when reciting verse. A solicitor writes a will that ensures a companion will be housed discreetly. In private gardens, men who work in government stand far enough from the path to avoid recognition and near enough to hear each other. If discretion had a guild, it would issue membership cards that fold twice and reveal nothing when opened. Blackmail haunts these rooms like a draft. No one can find and no one can fix. A careless letter is a livelihood for a villain who knows where shame pays best. Police stings make the newspapers giddy. A name that once commanded deference begins to draw smirks. You remember the trials of Oscar Wilde in 1895. The phrase gross indecency printed so many times, it starts to sound like a brand of soap. Reading those reports is like feeling a city clap its hands over its mouth and then laugh behind the fingers. A lesson spreads. Do not keep notes unless you plan to live without sleep. Yet a different thread refuses the language of doom. Edward Carpenter writes of comradeship in sturdy prose, and shares a life openly with George Merrill in a country house where the cat gets equal attention. Friends visit and discover that ordinary affection can be its own defense. The kettle sings. The garden behaves. The philosophy here is simple. Love that makes a bed and a breakfast table is not a scandal. It is groceries and patience and 2 pairs of boots near the door. The vision is not grand. It is durable. Clandestine groups experiment with structure. You hear of the Order of Charoenea, founded in the late 1890s by George Cecil Ives, a tiny secret society that sketches rituals, keeps roles, and dreams of reform when the world is less jumpy. Meetings are quiet. The name is classical enough to pass any but the most alert doorkeeper. Whether the membership ever grows beyond a dedicated few is a matter for debate and memoirs written with selective memory. Historians still argue whether such societies helped more by binding courage than by plotting practical change. But even a knot of resolve can keep a person from drifting. Code accumulates the way cities do, piece by piece. Iranian becomes a word that sounds noble and slightly scholarly. Friends of the Greek manner becomes a joke with respectable vowels. The safest code is still ordinary talk done carefully. 2 men discuss a cricket score and mention a wicket by name that happens to be the place they will meet at dusk. They exchange books like explorers trading maps. They borrow each other's coats more often than weather requires. No one remarks until someone wants to cause trouble, at which point every coat becomes evidence. The law presses hardest in the smallest spaces. Private rooms become dangerous because privacy now equals proof. A lodging house owner knocks without waiting because a sudden entry provides a stronger case. Caution demands windows left open, doors unlatched. The permanent possibility that a second person can claim to have witnessed nothing remarkable. The arithmetic is ridiculous and necessary. If paranoia counted as exercise, this crowd would have the healthiest hearts in London. Poets and essayists try to give the love a language clean enough to survive censors and truthful enough to feel like air. One writes about the intermediate sex, groping toward the idea that love can live between categories and deserve protection precisely because it harms no one. Another goes back to Plato and points out that mentoring and eros sit uneasily in the same paragraph, a discomfort some Uranian verse ignores. The discussion grows thorny, even within the circle. Ethics must be argued, not assumed. You are relieved to hear minds as sharp as their collars refuse to romanticize harm. Class complicates everything. A gentleman risks scandal and prison, yet he may hire a barrister and quantifiable sympathy. A clerk risks loss of livelihood with no cushion. A soldier or telegraph boy risks caning, and the swift disappearance of references that keep the future possible. The same city that produces refined defenses of comradeship also produces corners where power speaks softly and expects fear to nod. Historians still argue whether the Uranian ideal primarily belonged to elite men who used antiquity as a fig leaf, while working-class networks relied on different codes and different places to breathe. Even so, tenderness insists. Letters mention hands held under a coat. Poems keep appearing that celebrate a walk on a drizzly afternoon, where the street looks like pewter, and the conversation never once says love while saying nothing else, all the way down the embankment. A ribbon saved in a drawer, a visiting card folded and kept, a photograph without a frame. These are the relics of a devotion that refuses to take dictation from a statute. Satire nips at heels as satire always does. Cartoons in magazines hint that bachelors who dote on upholstery may also dote on each other. Slang accumulates in barracks and music halls. Some of it is kind, more of it is not. The green carnation joke fades when trials make colours feel dangerous. Yet in certain drawing rooms a lyric from Whitman is murmured as a toast, and nobody spills the sherry. If shared taste in poetry were admissible evidence, half the clubs in St. James's would have to shut by supper. You end your walk under plane trees that shake soot from their leaves. The city keeps its masks set to neutral, but the air carries warm traces of lives that persist where law demands erasure. Men meet, part, write, misjudge, forgive, and plan again with care measured in teaspoons. The philosophy they cultivate asks for dignity without disguise, and safety without silence. It will take more calendars to earn either. Yet the vocabulary is already in the mouth, steady and calm. You breathe and feel how strange it is to hide what harms no one, and how brave it is to keep loving anyway. You pause on a narrow Fitzrovia street, where the brick looks clean enough to eat a sandwich off it. The curtains are modest, and the door knocker seems to know too much. A cab turns the corner, as if trained not to rattle, and a boy in a pillbox cap strides past with the quick legs of someone who has learned to walk between raindrops. The address in your head is Cleveland Street, and the house you are looking at does not advertise anything except discretion. Even the ivy keeps its voice down. You stand a moment longer and feel how the quiet itself might be part of the service. In 1889, police uncover a male brothel at 19 Cleveland Street in London, frequented by telegraph messenger boys from the General Post Office. The investigation soon brushes the names of high-born clients. Among them, Lord Arthur Somerset, and in rumour, Henry Fitzroy, Earl of Euston. The keeper, Charles Hammond, flees abroad. Some of the boys are charged and testify. The affair becomes known as the Cleveland Street Scandal, and grows into a test of how far the law will reach when titled reputations get splashed by cold water. You follow a messenger round the corner, and onto a side lane that smells of damp brick and boiled cabbage. The uniform carries brass buttons, a red band on the cap, and the authority of speed. Boys deliver all day, a rhythm that teaches them the city's pulse better than most policemen ever learn it. That knowledge is a currency, and in certain evenings it spends. Clients admire legs that never walk slowly. Clients admire the confidence that comes from knocking on strangers' doors, as if the city belonged to you by appointment. The irony that the empire's nervous system becomes the recruitment ground for something the empire's moralists pretend not to recognize would be funnier if the stakes were lower. Inside the house, so the statements say, the rooms are modest, the curtains heavy, and the bell quick to answer. There is a ledger that does not overtly exist, except when it suddenly does, with initials and times. Careful handwriting that suggests the pen never shook. Tea is served because tea is a universal alibi. If anyone asks, a boy is fetching a parcel or warming his hands by the fire. The city runs on alibis, the way it runs on coal. You listen and can almost hear the hush, like warm breath caught in velvet. Police attention begins with a rumor, then a name, then an interview in a station where the clock ticks too loudly. A detective asks a boy where he spends his evenings. The boy says walking. The detective says walking is healthy. Then he asks which pavements. The boy's pause writes a paragraph without ink. One statement leads to another. The thread gathers names, addresses, and a pattern of payments that sound like generous tips until someone adds columns. Accountants never set out to be dramatic, yet give them a ledger and they will make a duchess nervous. The investigation moves upstairs and sideways. Telegraph supervisors become surprised. A magistrate becomes very calm. A briefcase becomes heavier. When the rumors climb the social ladder, gravity changes. Lord Arthur Somerset, equerry to the Prince of Wales, is questioned. Solicitors clear their throats with professional eloquence. Before long, Somerset leaves for France and then Belgium on a health tour that is coincidentally excellent for avoiding court dates. The brothel keeper is already across the channel. You can feel the doors closing softly where marble meets carpet. In the papers, the story leaks and then floods. Some editors, cautious of libel, speak of a certain house, a certain traffic, a certain laxity in official circles. Others are braver, or simply hungrier. The North London press prints names and earns the attention of the courts. Its editor, Ernest Park, accuses the Earl of Euston of visiting the house and is convicted of criminal libel. He serves time. The Earl wins damages and polishes his wounded dignity publicly. Trials produce testimonies that do not always match each other once shaken. The public reads columns the way they usually read serial fiction, with outrage and biscuits. Collectors later whisper that some telegraph boys, short of coin, sold spare brass buttons from old uniforms to admirers, a tiny trophy with the royal cipher still visible. It sounds like a joke the city tells on itself, neat and sordid at once. Historians still argue whether that button trade actually happened more than a few times, or whether it grew in retelling like any anecdote that satisfies too neatly. Either way, a polished button has always tempted a magpie eye, and London has never lacked for magpies. The legal machinery hums at 2 speeds. For working-class defendants, it rattles briskly. For gentlemen, it idles, and occasionally stalls. Boys are sentenced, fined, scolded. A proprietor vanishes. A lord is advised to travel for his nerves. The Home Office discusses everything at the pace of cold soup. Meanwhile, a detective frowns at his notes and wonders why his feet can find certain addresses more easily than his pen can write certain names. If timetables were written by deference, every slow train would be called express. Sermons multiply. One orator declares that the nation must root out secret vice the way a gardener digs nettles. Another declares that a witch hunt harms the innocent more than the guilty, and prefers to talk about temperance instead. Music halls produce quick couplets that rhyme Cleveland with evened and scandal with candle, and the audience laughs more loudly than the jokes deserve because laughter is cheaper than thinking. In private, people mark their diaries with asterisks and look more carefully at the men who borrow their newspapers. The rumour that spreads furthest attaches itself to a royal name and never entirely lets go. Whispers suggest that Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, drifted near this circle. No proof is produced that lasts longer than a morning edition. No charge touches him. Biographers later produce alibis, calendars, and the assertion that gossip married convenience and called it truth. Historians still argue whether the government suppressed lines of inquiry out of honest caution against slander or out of protective instinct that preferred titles to evidence. The argument refuses to retire, partly because silence is such a persuasive storyteller. You read depositions and find detail that feels too ordinary to have been invented. A hallway carpet of a certain pattern, a mantel clock that never kept the right time, a boy who did the coal scuttle willingly only on the nights he expected extra coin. Then you find detail that feels almost rehearsed. A script mutually agreed upon in the corridor before the witness stepped in. That is how scandal works. Truth and performance share a coat. The audience gets cold trying to separate sleeves. The post office worries about reputation. Supervisors remind boys that the crown on their buttons is not a decoration, but a promise. Boys nod, pocket their wages, and continue to live in a city where rent arrives weekly and temptation arrives hourly. Some are barely 16. Some have families counting coins in rooms where sunlight seems taxed. Others enjoy the swagger of youth and spend as if life were a long Saturday. The same uniform that opened respectable doors, opened others where reputations were negotiable. You can sympathize and still wince. In Parliament, questions are asked with the careful tone reserved for dynamite. The Home Secretary faces inquiries about who knew what, when, and whether the law was applied with one set of boots in the slum and another on the club carpet. Replies are polished until they shine and reflect nothing. Committees consider papers that smell faintly of cigar and self-preservation. The words public interest do heavy lifting without ever sweating. Meanwhile, the house on Cleveland Street empties. Curtains come down for cleaning and never go back up. A landlord pretends he never liked the tenants anyway. Neighbors acquire retroactive second sight and claim they always suspected something, although they cannot remember exactly what. The pavement keeps its tact. The gutter remembers more than it tells. When a listing says quiet street, the walls usually have a memoir half written. The aftermath lingers in careers that end earlier than planned. In boys who move to other districts and learn to keep their caps lower. In a city that adds one more cautionary tale to the store, it recites behind closed doors. The scandal becomes a shorthand for hypocrisy, hard law for the poor, soft landing for the well-connected. It also becomes a reminder that desire finds paths through uniforms, fees, and fear, and that trying to seal every door only teaches people to draw better maps. You step away from the curb and listen to the traffic. Decide what it wants to be this hour. A messenger clatters by with a wire that will change dinner plans across town. A gentleman studies a shop window and examines his own reflection instead. The house on the corner looks briefly like any other London house, which is its truest disguise. Scandal loves an ordinary frame. It helps the picture sell. You walk on quieter than before, not because you have solved anything, but because you have heard how softly a whole city can clear its throat when a story comes too close to its own front step. You follow the smell of ink into a back lane where the shutters wear a permanent squint and a cat naps on paper that looks suspiciously like proof sheets. Inside a narrow shop, the compositor feeds type into a stick, his fingers quick, the letters nicked and shiny from long service. A boy called the printer's devil scuttles between cases, his hands black up to the wrists, his grin a crescent moon cut from carbon. He passes you a tin mug that might once have held tea, and now holds discarded sorts, and one bent comma that everyone keeps out of respect. The room is warm, close and busy with secrets. You feel the floorboards tick under your boots and realize that some stories only dry after they have been read. In the late 19th century, underground erotic publishing in Britain operates through small private presses, back rooms off Holywell Street and beyond, and sometimes on the continent where printers in Amsterdam or Brussels set type for English clients who prefer distance to discretion at home. Titles move under plain wrappers, often declared in customs as medical or continental literature, then distributed by subscription, trusted booksellers, or hand-to-hand in clubs that do not keep minutes. Seizures occur under the Obscene Publications Act, yet the trade endures by moving faster than warrants and smarter than ledgers. The compositor taps the stick and slides lines into a galley with the satisfaction of a person fitting rails. He is setting a stitch-bound pamphlet for private circulation only, which is a phrase that means anyone with cash and courage. The front matter carries a mock publisher name that belongs to a firm in Paternoster Row that burned down 15 years ago. An address in Vienna provides a further layer of fog. The text is lively, the punctuation enthusiastic, and the author is everybody and nobody. The printer shrugs when you ask who wrote it. He cares more about spacing and getting paid. In the corner sits a trunk that has travelled so often, it believes in reincarnation. Labels from Antwerp, Ostend, and Calais overlap like scales. The trick, the proprietor explains, is to pack the naughty between the dull, 2 stacks of sermons at the top, an agricultural almanac below, and in the middle the folded signatures of a volume that will not adopt its title until it is safely in an attic. If customs opens the trunk, the first few items look as starchy as a Sunday shirt. If they dig deeper, the plan fails, and everyone practices the solemn art of innocence. If plausible deniability paid rent, this trunk would own the building. Some clandestine editions are cased in bindings from ruined libraries. Real calf with old gilt still whispering the name of a dead bishop's sermons. The binder slides the fresh text block into the antique skin, and the result fools even a careful glance on a gentleman's shelf. Historians still argue whether this cannibal binding was a frequent trick or a rare flourish for wealthy clients who enjoyed the blasphemous joke. A number of suspiciously pious spines in private sales suggest the practice had at least a spirited following. The shop keeps a parcel ready for a tobacconist who sells shaving soap and reputable cigars, and upon request, a pamphlet under the counter. Transactions are quiet. Cash counts in whispers. The tobacconist wraps the goods in brown paper, with a receipt that lists hardware. A coachman collects bundles for a hotel porter, who knows which travelers want a souvenir that never appears on a bill. When raids grow likely, the network pauses, doors remain latched. Type sleeps in forms under a tea towel like a patient aunt. You realize the business survives not on daring but on timing. One title casts a longer shadow than the rest. The anonymous memoir that later circulates under the name My Secret Life grows into a leviathan of confession, printed privately in multiple large volumes toward the end of the century, likely with continental type and cautious English hands guiding the money. The narrator catalogues encounters with the persistence of an accountant and the appetite of a myth. Researchers debate which passages record fact and which are embroidered to suit a client's purse. The physical books themselves become talismans, seen by few, spoken of widely, and smuggled like relics. The gossip is almost as thick as the paper. You watch a proofreader quarrel about commas and morals. One insists the comma belongs after delight. The other insists morality never benefited from punctuation. They break for tea that tastes cheerfully of dust and victory. In quieter tones, they discuss the Society for the Suppression of Vice, the National Vigilance Association, and magistrates who keep Hicklin tucked in a pocket like a handkerchief with a memory. Everyone knows a story about a neighbor whose back room was cleared by men with polite hats. Everyone knows a story about a constable who looked the other way because his cousin sets type and his aunt needs rent. Smuggling methods display cheerful ingenuity. Parcels ride in hollowed sample cases for shoe salesmen. False bottoms in crates hide stacks of stitched sections under layers of straw that make the inspector sneeze. One carrier swears by umbrella tubes with scrolls tucked inside. A parade of rainy days no one thinks to open. If umbrellas were honest, half the contraband in London would have to find new walking sticks. Printers' devils earn their nickname, as much for mischief as for ink. The boy here dyes his hair with soot when a raid is rumoured, convinced no one will recognise him. He swaps clean galleys with spoiled ones, and hides risky forms under sheets labelled tax tables. He earns pennies, tea, and stories that would scorch the varnish off a respectable table. When the form is finally locked and the frisket drops, he leans close to watch the press bite paper. He grins because every impression is a small rescue. The text that exists on paper becomes harder to erase than a rumour. The catalogue of underground titles shifts with fashion like hem lengths. Flagellation tales enjoy a long run. Continental novels trade translators the way hotels trade chefs. Illustrations arrive engraved on separate plates that are stored nowhere near the type. The plates travel wrapped in cloth and claim to be botanical studies if anyone asks. The erotic periodical, called The Pearl, appears briefly in London in 1879 and 1880, a monthly with verse tales and running serials, then disappears amid legal heat and vanishing publishers, leaving behind a legend and a handful of surviving numbers that librarians treat with gloves and frowns. The risk breeds humour with sharp teeth. One bookseller keeps a bell under the counter wired to a friend's door in the lane. If strangers enter with hats too official, the bell tings, and a sheet is thrown over the stock like a table preparing for ghosts. Another codes orders with culinary metaphors. A customer asks for 2 lobsters and a lemon, meaning a pair of volumes and a naughty plate. The ledger records seafood for a month. The fishmonger next door never understands why people leave the shop looking so well fed. If decency were a spice, these recipes would taste exactly the same. Scholarly arguments crawl over these texts like tiny detectives with magnifying glasses. Who wrote what? Where was it printed? How many copies existed at once? And which episodes reflect real lives rather than paid invention? Historians still argue whether clandestine fiction mainly mirrored the desires of a narrow clientele, or seeped into broader reading habits via copying and storytelling in workshops and kitchens. Evidence is skewed by survival. Police kept what they seized. Collectors hid what they loved. Printers burned what would convict them. The archive is a game of musical chairs where half the chairs are imaginary. Yet, the pattern that emerges is simple. Print wants to travel. It finds allies in bored apprentices and night porters, in ship stewards and travelling drapers, in any person with a quiet corner and a pocket that can hold paper. It survives because readers treat it like correspondence from a private country. They smuggle, lend, copy, and remember. The boy with ink to his elbows washes at the pump until the water runs grey. The compositor stacks forms away from the window. The trunk shuts. The cat yawns and occupies the warmest sheet. You step back into the lane, and the air tastes of coal and ink, which is to say ambition. Somewhere a parcel thumps into a cab. Somewhere a customs man sneezes theatrically and waves a crate through. The city prefers not to see everything at once. Books climb shelves in rooms that will never be photographed. A single bent comma glints in your pocket like a souvenir. It once anchored a sentence that tried to hide and failed, which is as noble a job as any piece of punctuation could hope for. You arrive at a set of iron gates where roses climb politely, and the signboard whispers the word refuge in careful paint. The gravel path is swept to a tight brightness. Windows watch without blinking. A bell pull hangs beside the door, and when you tug it, the sound rolls through corridors that smell of soap, wet linen, and boiled starch. A sister appears with a face that tries to be stern and kind in the same inch of skin, an expression that must ache by evening. She invites you in with a nod that feels like a rule wearing a smile. Across 19th century Britain, rescue societies, and Magdalene, or penitentiary homes, admit women labeled fallen, a word that tries to do the work of a paragraph. Anglican houses like the House of Mercy at Clewar, Roman Catholic convents in several cities, and nonconformist missions in grim brick buildings run on the same promise. Salvation paired with work. Laundry rooms thunder from dawn until the supper bell, and the institution takes in baskets from hotels, officers' messes, and wealthy households, a trade that pays bills while preaching repair. You pass a cloakroom where dresses become uniforms. The garments are plain, dyed the color of winter, with collars that scratch a little to remind the wearer to think upward. Aprons hang like small flags of good intention. A cupboard holds work shoes with toes battered by tubs and floors. In the laundry hall, the heat is immediate. The steam a white weather that blurs faces and makes hair curl even when it does not mean to. Mangling rollers thump, irons hiss, water slaps the inside of copper vats with the rhythm of a regiment. You recognize a ritual in this noise, a catechism of labor that expects daily recitation. The timetable lives on a chalkboard: rise at 6, chapel at 7, breakfast of porridge and strong tea, laundry until the midday prayer, a plate of stew and thick bread, laundry again until the Angelus. Evening reading, silence after 9, discipline appears in small corners, needles are counted out and counted back, pins are tallied as if pins can absolve, letters home if permitted are read before posting and opened on return, a logic that says trust is welcome as long as it can be inspected. If virtue were measured in the number of spoons returned to the drawer, this house would already be a cathedral. A sister shows you the workroom where girls hem sheets and repair collars. The air quieter, but no cooler. A Bible sits open near the window. A pot of starch stands like a little volcano. The rules on the wall request modest speech, steady eyes, and hands kept busy, because idleness is the door through which trouble walks in wearing polished boots. A novice hums a hymn while folding towels into piles that look like obedience stacked in squares. You feel tender and stubborn at once, which is a reasonable reaction in a place that asks for both humility and miracles by Tuesday. Laundry mark codes, tiny embroidered initials and symbols that tell which household owns which mountain of linen. Some homes keep cipher books to translate a baffling alphabet of triangles, lines, and looped letters, a secret language that only the laundry knows. There are stories that some houses cropped hair on admission, partly for order, partly to discourage leaving, and partly because lice obey no commandments at all. Historians still argue whether cropping was routine across British homes, or mainly associated with a handful of stricter convents, and with emergency dousing after rescue raids. The scissors lie quietly in a drawer, unwilling to testify either way. The chapel offers a cooler hush. Wooden pews smell of beeswax and winter coats. Mary Magdalene gazes down from a glass window with eyes that have already cried and then learned to look forward. The sermon never names anyone in the room, yet everybody hears their name. Forgiveness arrives in the script, practical and solemn, and always chained to work. The promise is that soap and prayer can wash history into appointment bedsheets. You are not entirely persuaded, yet you cannot call the promise insincere. Voices rise, clear and young, and for a moment the steam of the laundry seems to exhale a little less fiercely. Admission stories are not simple. Some women present themselves after nights that ended with shouts and a locked door behind them. Some arrive escorted by missionaries who work the stations and the Haymarket and the docks, offering shelter with words that sound like a hand on a fevered forehead. Some are sent by magistrates who prefer rescue to prison for a first offence, a choice that looks merciful on paper. Others are delivered by families that cannot face the neighbours or the arithmetic of a child on the way. Consent appears here like a coin that changes hands quickly and sometimes gets lost. The account books reveal a tidy commerce. Parlours send tablecloths in baskets tied with navy ribbon. Barracks send sheets that smell faintly of polish and boot blacking. Hotels send mountains of napkins that make the sisters nod in satisfaction. The work trains muscles and burns cheeks pink. And by night the dormitory breathes like a ship at anchor. Pay is not a wage. It is maintenance, bed, board, a portion for mending, and perhaps a little credit for when a girl is deemed ready to leave. If she leaves. The door opens outward, but not without counsel, and sometimes not without an argument conducted at the tone of cool politeness that replaces shouting in respectable buildings. The London Magdalen Hospital for the reception of penitent prostitutes dates to the 18th century and continues through the Victorian decades, joined by newer homes that multiply with evangelical energy. Many require probation, new names for privacy, and months of trial before a resident can move to a lower ward, then to a position in service, a carefully brokered place where employers agree to take a chance. Success stories are printed in annual reports. Stories of marriage, of respectable service, of steady housekeeping. Failure stories are not printed as often. Charities share hope and statistics on a need-to-know basis. In the sewing room, a girl is trusted with the iron that ruins anything it touches if handled carelessly. She concentrates like a sculptor. Another girl, new and brittle, waits for instructions with hands hidden in her sleeves. The sister explains the use of blue bag for whitening, and the danger of leaving an iron face down. The instruction is practical, and a little maternal. The girl nods, and you watch courage arriving in small sips. If redemption could be rolled out as evenly as a pillowcase, the world would be a neater place. Critics write that these institutions save bodies and break spirits, that penitential language justifies unpaid labor, and that real rescue would include wages and choices that can be made without supervision. Defenders answer that the homes keep young women from jail and disease, teach trades that pay, and give safety in a city that is not gentle. Historians still argue whether most residents experienced rescue houses as protection with rules or as coercion with hymns, and whether the balance changed across denominations, decades, and streets. The archive holds ledgers, sermons, and rare letters smuggled to friends, and it is hard to weigh paper against breath. Rules about visitors are strict. Family may come by appointment, seen across a table while a sister sits nearby repairing a cuff. Men are not welcomed except in the figure of ministers and trustees who sign checks and do not look closely at the laundry pans. Very young children, if present, are kept in a separate nursery watched by women whose hands are already busy. Departure often means a place in service, arranged by a placement officer with letters of character ready. Some employers are kind. Some are exactly what fear warned about. The sisters keep a list, add notes, and try to steer future placements accordingly. The day you visit ends with cooling irons, and the gentle chime that sends everyone to the refectory. A stew served in tin bowls appears almost grateful to be eaten. Conversation stays low about needles and the hymn number, about the new girl from King's Cross, who has the prettiest singing voice and the heaviest heart. A resident reads from a moral tale that does not mention laundry even once, which feels like a missed opportunity. If literature truly wished to improve society, it would include more practical tips about getting starch out of cuffs. The dormitory is spare. Bedspreads match. Shoes line up like soldiers who have learned humility. A tiny mirror hangs between windows that frame a square of dark sky. Somewhere a woman whispers a prayer. Somewhere another promises herself that tomorrow she will ask about a post in a dressmaker's workroom. Anything to leave the steam. You stand a moment and listen to the even breathing that follows a day of heavy work, a sound that belongs to ships and farms and lives. Outside, the roses still pretend to be gentle by nature. The gate closes with the sound of patience, not prison, although the difference depends very much on who is holding the key. The street smells of wet stone and soot. In your pocket, a scrap of laundry code, weights, triangles and dots that once told a maid which sheets belong to which. Colonel, charity here wears a starched collar. Punishment does not shout, it organizes. Somewhere between those two truths, many lives found shelter.